Close your eyes and picture the city you know best. The streets you walk every day, the buildings that frame your sky, the sounds of traffic, conversation, the hum of a million small lives intersecting. Now imagine waking up tomorrow and finding it all gone, not destroyed by war or disaster, simply erased, forgotten, as if it never existed at all. This isn't fantasy, it's pattern. It's history repeating in a rhythm we've only just begun to recognize. Right now, beneath the ground you stand on, there are cities, not ruins in the way you might imagine crumbled stones and broken columns. Complete cities, streets that once echoed with the footsteps of merchants arguing over prices, courtyards where children played games whose rules are now lost, bedrooms where people dreamed of futures that never came. These places didn't fail because their people were primitive or foolish. They vanished because they were exactly like us. Confident, ambitious, certain of their permanence. Archaeologists speak carefully about numbers, but their estimates are staggering. Thousands of cities lie undiscovered across the planet, under jungles so thick that sunlight barely reaches the forest floor, beneath deserts that shift and reshape with every wind, submerged in oceans that have swallowed entire coastlines as the world's climate has changed and changed again over millennia. Some of these cities housed populations larger than modern capitals. They had governments, trade networks, art, music, literature. They had everything we have. Then they had nothing. The question that haunts archaeologists, the one that should haunt all of users. Simple in its asking, terrifying in its implications. How does a city disappear? Not a village, not a camp. A city. Something built to last generations, something that represents the highest achievement of human cooperation. Tens of thousands of people don't simply forget where they live. Infrastructure doesn't evaporate. Yet somehow, across every continent, across every era of human history, cities have done exactly that. They've faded from memory so completely that when explorers stumble upon them centuries later, the discovery makes headlines. We're shocked. How could we have forgotten? In the past decade alone, technology has revealed sites that force historians to revise timelines they thought were settled. Cities appearing on satellite scans where maps showed only wilderness. Structures emerging from jungle canopy and LiDAR images, their scale suggesting civilizations far more advanced than we believed possible for their time. Each discovery carries the same unsettling message. We don't know our own history. We've been walking past the evidence of entire vanished worlds and we never noticed. These lost cities aren't just archaeological curiosities, they're time capsules containing something more valuable than gold or jade. They hold the story of what happens when civilizations reach too far, adapt too slowly, or simply run out of time. Understanding why they disappeared might be the most important investigation we ever undertake, because the forces that erased them from existence, climate change, resource depletion, social collapse, the simple refusal to adapt when everything depends on changing those forces haven't disappeared. They're still here. They're accelerating. But what exactly makes a city lost? The term sounds simple. Lost city. Two words that conjure images of vine-covered temples and sand-buried palaces. But the reality is far more complicated, far more unsettling than the phrase suggests. A city can house 1 million people, stand for 1,000 years, and still be lost. The question isn't whether the physical place exists. It's whether anyone remembers, whether anyone knows what they're looking at when they see it. Consider 3 kinds of vanishing, each revealing something different about how we forget. First, there are cities that were never actually lost. Machu Picchu, that iconic symbol of rediscovery, sat perched in the Peruvian mountains while local farmers grazed their livestock among its terraces. When Hiram Bingham arrived in 1911, guided by those same farmers, he didn't discover the city. He introduced it to a Western audience that had convinced itself such places couldn't exist. The city had been there all along. It was the outside world that was lost, not the ruins. Then there are places like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, buried for 11,000 years, no myths, no legends, no cultural memory whatsoever, just a hill that farmers avoided because the soil was full of stones. When archaeologists finally excavated in the 1990s, they found something that rewrote human history. Massive stone temples built by people who weren't supposed to have the organization or technology for such projects. These cities vanish so completely that even their existence becomes impossible to imagine. The forgetting is total. The third category might be the most disturbing. Cities whose very existence was disputed. places mentioned in ancient texts that scholars dismissed as fiction or exaggeration. Then technology improves, or coastlines shift, or someone looks at a satellite image from the right angle. Suddenly, the impossible becomes concrete. Structures emerge from beneath ocean waves or desert sands, proving that the myths were memories all along. These cities teach us that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. It's just evidence of insufficient searching. This raises an uncomfortable question. Why do some cities linger in human memory as legends while others disappear without even leaving myths behind? Atlantis haunts Western imagination despite no physical evidence. El Dorado drove conquistadors to madness. Yet cities that actually existed, that housed thousands of people for centuries, vanished so thoroughly that we don't even know what to call them. We find their ruins and assign them placeholder names because their real names died with the last person who spoke their language. Archaeologists have a term for this phenomenon: archaeological amnesia. It happens faster than you'd think. A language dies when its last speakers pass. Records burn in a single fire. A conquering army deliberately erases the history of the conquered. Within 3 generations, a city can transform from living memory to vague legend to complete oblivion. The physical structures might stand for millennia, but without context they're just strange hills. Unusual rock formations, nothing worth investigating. Some cities, though, were hidden on purpose. Recent research suggests certain civilizations deliberately concealed important sites, kept their locations secret even from neighboring cultures. The reasons vary: religious sanctity, strategic advantage, protection from invaders. These cities challenge our assumption that people always wanted their achievements remembered. Sometimes they wanted them forgotten. There's another layer to this. For centuries, the narrative of discovery was written by European archaeologists who claimed credit for finding cities that local populations had never lost track of. They walked past indigenous people who could have told them exactly what the ruins were, then planted flags and named things after themselves. Who gets to decide when a city is lost? Who benefits from that classification? The answer matters because it shapes what we look for and how we interpret what we find. Some cities don't fit our categories. They resist easy definition, and those might be the ones with the most important stories to tell. So where do we begin our search? The answer lies in the stories humans have been telling for thousands of years. Legends that scholars dismissed as fantasy until the ruins started emerging from the earth. For centuries, scholars laughed at anyone who believed Homer's Iliad was real. The story of Troy, of Helen and Achilles and the wooden horse, belonged to literature, not history. Beautiful poetry, compelling narrative, but surely not a guidebook to actual places and events. Then came Heinrich Schliemann. In 1871, this German businessman turned amateur archaeologist did something the experts considered madness. He treated the Iliad as a literal treasure map. He studied the geographical descriptions in Homer's verses, traced the journey of the Greek fleet, calculated distances and landmarks. Then he started digging at a hill in northwestern Turkey called Helike. The academic establishment waited for his embarrassment. Instead, he found Troy. Or rather, he found 9 cities, stacked one atop another like layers in a cake, each built on the ruins of the last. The discovered archaeology. If Troy was real, what else from ancient poetry might be grounded in fact? Paradigm shifted overnight. Suddenly, myths weren't just stories. They were potential historical records encoded in narrative form, passed down through generations until the facts became wrapped in legend. The challenge became learning how to decode them. Consider Jericho. The biblical account describes walls falling to the sound of trumpets. Archaeological evidence reveals a city that was indeed destroyed, its fortifications collapsing in a manner consistent with earthquake damage. The trumpets might be embellishment, but the catastrophic destruction of a walled city matches the myth's core. The story preserved a memory of real disaster, even as it attributed the cause to divine intervention rather than tectonic activity. Or, take the Minoans of Crete. Ancient Greek legends spoke of a sophisticated sea civilization, of King Minos and his labyrinth, of a culture so advanced it seemed almost magical. Scholars assumed these were pure fantasy. Then excavations in the early 20th century revealed palace complexes of stunning sophistication, indoor plumbing, multi-story architecture, elaborate frescoes depicting bleeping ceremonies. The labyrinth might be metaphorical, but the advanced maritime civilization was absolutely real. The myths had been telling the truth, just in coded language. More recently, archaeologists found Helike, a Greek city lost in 373 BCE. Ancient texts described it being swallowed by the earth during a catastrophic earthquake, disappearing beneath the sea in a single night. For 2,000 years, this seemed like obvious exaggeration. Cities don't just vanish. Then in 2001, researchers located the ruins exactly where the ancient sources said they would be, buried under coastal sediment. The catastrophic earthquake had indeed occurred. The overnight destruction was literal, not poetic license. These discoveries have forced a complete reconsideration of how we approach ancient stories. Archaeologists now actively mine myths for clues, looking for geographical references, descriptions of natural disasters, details about architecture or customs. They've developed methodologies for separating the probable historical core from later embellishments. A story about gods might point to real leaders. A tale of monsters might encode memories of encountering unfamiliar animals or people. Flood narrative might preserve actual climate catastrophe. But some legends still resist explanation. Atlantis, described by Plato in extraordinary detail, has never been definitively located despite countless expeditions. El Dorado drove conquistadors to madness but remains elusive. Shambhala appears in Tibetan traditions as a hidden kingdom, its location deliberately obscured. Are these pure inventions? Metaphors? Or are they like Troy, waiting for someone to take them seriously enough to search in the right place? The pattern holds across cultures. Every civilization has its lost city myths. The Hopi speak of previous worlds that were destroyed. Australian Aboriginal traditions describe coastal lands now underwater. Hindu texts mention cities swallowed by the ocean. Chinese legends tell of kingdoms buried beneath the Taklamakan desert. The specifics vary, but the theme is universal. Humans remember catastrophe. We encode it in story. We pass it down. This suggests something profound about our relationship with the past. We don't forget, not entirely. Even when the historical record is destroyed, when languages die and empires fall, the stories persist. They mutate. They acquire fantastic elements. But somewhere in their DNA, truth remains. The line between myth and history isn't a line at all. It's a gradient, a spectrum where facts fade into legend so gradually that determining where one ends and the other begins becomes impossible. And maybe that's the point. Maybe myths survive precisely because they're flexible enough to carry truth without being burdened by rigid accuracy. But finding lost cities isn't just about following old stories. Sometimes the greatest discoveries happen when explorers venture into places where no ancient texts exist, where the jungle itself has kept secrets for over 1,000 years. And that's where our first journey begins, into the green heart of Central America, where an entire civilization vanished into the trees. There's a specific moment that happens when you find a lost city in the jungle. You've been walking for hours through green so dense it feels solid. The air is thick enough to drink. Every surface crawls with life. Then suddenly the vegetation changes. The trees grow at strange angles. Roots wrap around shapes that don't belong. And you realize the hill you've been climbing isn't a hill at all. It's a pyramid. This is how most Mayan cities reveal themselves. Not dramatically, not all at once, slowly, like a shape emerging from fog. A carved stone face peers out from beneath moss and lichen. A courtyard reveals itself as the space between massive trees whose roots have spent centuries prying apart ancient plazas. What looks like a natural ridge in the landscape turns out to be a palace complex, its rooms filled with soil and vegetation, its roof collapsed into corridors where jaguars now sleep. By 900 CE, this scene repeated across Central America on a staggering scale. Dozens of thriving cities, some housing populations in the tens of thousands, were abandoned within a single century. Not conquered, not destroyed, simply left behind. The Maya walked away from centuries of achievement, from temples that took generations to build, from homes where families had lived for lifetimes. Jungle, patient and relentless, began the work of reclamation. The preservation is paradoxical. The same moisture and vegetation that hide these cities also protect them. Jungle growth shields stone from direct sunlight and wind erosion. Root systems stabilize structures even as they invade them. Massive temples that would have crumbled in desert environments stand for over 1,000 years, transformed into living sculptures where stone and tree merge into something neither natural nor artificial. Here's what makes the story more complicated. Most of these cities were never truly lost. Local Maya communities knew exactly where the old stones were. They'd been living around them, sometimes using them as landmarks or gathering places, for centuries. When Western archaeologists arrived and announced their discoveries, the villagers must have been confused. How can you discover something that everyone already knows about? But in 2018, technology revealed something that even the locals hadn't fully grasped. LiDAR surveys aircraft shooting billions of laser pulses through the jungle canopy to map the ground beneath showed over 60,000 Mayan structures that had been completely invisible to ground surveys. Not just buildings, entire cities, road networks, defensive fortifications, agricultural terraces. What archaeologists thought were isolated population centres turned out to be vast interconnected urban systems with raised stone causeways linking cities across distances that would have made them medieval superhighways. The population estimates had to be revised upward by millions. This wasn't a collection of ceremonial centres visited occasionally by scattered rural populations. This was sophisticated urbanism on a scale comparable to classical civilizations in the Mediterranean or China, which makes the central question even more disturbing. Why would a civilization at its absolute peak, with mathematical systems advanced enough to calculate planetary movements, with architectural expertise to rival any ancient culture, with agricultural knowledge that sustained millions, simply walk away? The temples were still standing, the fields were still fertile, the cities were still functional. Recent theories point toward mega-drought, toward warfare that escalated beyond control, toward environmental degradation from centuries of intensive agriculture. But these are fragments of explanation, pieces of a puzzle that doesn't quite fit together. The silence of these cities holds secrets we're only beginning to decode. But the Maya weren't alone in the jungle. Further south, in the Amazon rainforest, an even more controversial discovery was about to rewrite everything we thought we knew about ancient civilizations in the Americas. For 500 years, explorers called the Amazon an empty green hell, a wilderness so hostile, so overwhelming in its density and danger that substantial human civilization could never have taken root there. The soil was too poor, the nutrients locked in the canopy, not the earth. The jungle too aggressive, consuming anything humans tried to build. Scattered tribes, yes. Small settlements along rivers, perhaps. But cities? Kingdoms? Impossible. They were wrong. Spectacularly, fundamentally wrong. The jungle isn't hiding cities. In many places it's made of them. The revelation began quietly in the late 20th century. Archaeologists examining cleared areas from the air noticed something strange. Geometric patterns in the landscape. Perfect circles, squares, and parallel lines that couldn't be natural. Earthworks hundreds of meters across, visible only from above. At first these were dismissed as anomalies. Then they kept appearing. Dozens. Hundreds. All across the Amazon basin. Closer investigation revealed something even more startling. The soil in these areas was different, richer, darker, more fertile than anything the Amazon naturally produces. Terra preta, scientists called it. Black earth. Not naturally occurring, but human-made. Ancient Amazonians had discovered how to transform the jungle's notoriously poor soil into agricultural gold mines by mixing it with charcoal, bone, and organic waste. The technique was so effective that even after centuries of abandonment, these enriched zones remained dramatically more productive than surrounding areas. The implications crashed through archaeological consensus like a falling tree. If the soil was engineered, if the earthworks were deliberate, then the Amazon had supported populations far larger than anyone imagined. Not scattered tribes, but coordinated societies with the organization to undertake massive construction projects and the agricultural knowledge to feed substantial populations. The Cuhicugu complex in Brazil revealed the pattern clearly. Organized settlements connected by raised causeways, evidence of fish weirs, and aquaculture systems that managed river resources. Defensive palisades suggesting territorial boundaries and coordinated defense. This wasn't primitive survival. This was sophisticated urban planning. In acre state, more geometric earthworks emerged from deforested areas. Perfect circles and squares connected by straight roads. Their purpose still debated, but their intentional design undeniable. Some archaeologists suggest ceremonial functions. Others argue for defensive fortifications. Many suspect we're imposing our own categories on something we don't yet understand. Then came LiDAR surveys in Bolivia, revealing pre-Columbian urban planning at scales that seemed impossible. networks of settlements interconnected by causeways raised above seasonal floodplains, agricultural fields arranged in patterns that maximized water management. Population density estimates climbed into the millions for the Amazon basin as a whole. The irony is tragic and complete. When European diseases raced through the Americas in the 16th and 17th centuries, they moved faster than the colonizers themselves. Smallpox, measles, influenza plagues to which indigenous populations had no immunity devastated communities with mortality rates estimated at 90% or higher. Cities emptied in a single generation. Without people to maintain them, the jungle reclaimed its territory with remarkable speed. So when later European explorers penetrated deeper into the Amazon, they truly did find wilderness. They encountered scattered survivors. They saw endless forest. They concluded that the Amazon had always been this way, empty, pristine, untouched. They never suspected they were walking through the ruins of civilizations that had collapsed within living memory of the older indigenous people they encountered. The controversial part isn't just historical. Modern deforestation, destructive as it is, has been uncovering these sites. Satellite imagery reveals patterns only visible after trees are cleared. We're learning about lost civilizations through the same process that's destroying current ones. Discovery and destruction happening simultaneously. The Amazon likely contains hundreds, possibly thousands of unexcavated sites. Every LiDAR survey reveals structures that weren't in any database. Our understanding of pre-Columbian American civilization is still in its infancy. We're decades, maybe centuries, from comprehending the full scope of what was built, inhabited, and lost. While the jungle preserves cities in green cocoons, other landscapes operate differently. In the world's harshest deserts, lost cities don't hide. They become ghosts, their bones exposed to the sun, waiting for centuries for someone to recognize what they once were. The question that haunts every archaeologist who walks through a silent Mayan city is simple and terrible. Why did they leave? Not just one city, not just one crisis, but dozens of cities across an entire civilization within the span of a single century. The answers lie in sediment cores pulled from the bottom of lakes, tiny samples that contain years of rainfall recorded in chemical signatures. Between 800 and 900 CE, something catastrophic happened to the Mayan climate. Rainfall declined dramatically, not for a season, not for a few years, for decades. A mega drought that turned reliable agricultural zones into dust. Imagine the cascading failures. First, the corn harvest falls short. No problem. There are reserves. The storage facilities are full from better years. But the next year, the rains fail again. And the year after, the reserves deplete. Farmers plant in desperation, but the young plants wither. Great. Rivers that once flowed year-round become seasonal trickles. Archaeological evidence shows what happened next. Defensive fortifications appear around cities that never needed them before. Walls go up, moats are dug. The warfare that had always been part of Mayan culture are ritualized, controlled, fought for captives, and prestige transforms into something more desperate. Evidence of burning appears in palace complexes. Cities attack their neighbors not for glory but for food, for water, for survival. The skeletal remains tell a grim story. Malnutrition markers appear with increasing frequency. People are getting shorter, a sign that childhood nutrition is failing. Bones show stress, indicators lines where growth was interrupted by famine. Burials become less elaborate, as if the living could no longer afford to honor the dead properly. But perhaps the most devastating collapse was ideological. Mayan kings claimed divine authority. They were intermediaries between humans and gods, particularly the rain gods whose favor meant life or death for agricultural societies. They performed elaborate ceremonies, bloodletting rituals, astronomical observations, all designed to ensure cosmic balance and bring rain. When the rains didn't come, when prayers and sacrifices failed year after year, the entire theological foundation crumbled. If the king couldn't bring rain, what good was a king? The divine right to rule evaporated with the morning dew that no longer formed. Political authority collapsed along with the climate. The archaeological signature of abandonment is distinctive. Half-finished monuments suggest construction stopped abruptly. A temple platform reaches halfway to its intended height, then nothing. No gradual winding down. Cessation. Storage facilities show signs of burning rather than methodical emptying, suggesting chaos rather than orderly departure. People left, not in organized migrations but in desperate trickles, as each family made the calculation that anywhere else had to be better than staying. The Amazon tells a different story but reaches the same ending. There, the collapse wasn't environmental but biological. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they brought invisible weapons more deadly than any sword. Smallpox, measles, influenza, diseases that had circulated in Eurasia for millennia, giving populations there some resistance, hit the Americas like a tsunami hitting an unprepared coast. The pathogens moved faster than the colonizers. They raced through trade networks carried by infected individuals who walked hundreds of miles before dying. A single infected person arriving in a densely populated Amazonian city could trigger exponential spread. Within weeks, thousands were sick. Within months, the majority were dead. The mortality estimates are almost impossible to comprehend. Some scholars put the death rate at 90 to 95% within 150 years of European contact. Not 10%, not half. Nearly everyone, entire cities emptied, not because people left, but because they died. The few survivors scattered, traumatized, their social structures shattered, their knowledge bases destroyed because too few remained to pass them on. This might be the greatest catastrophe in human history, and it happened so quickly that the cities barely had time to understand what was killing them. Here's the twist that should disturb us most. These lost cities weren't lost because their people failed. The Maya didn't fail at civilization. They succeeded brilliantly. They built cities that supported millions. They developed sophisticated agriculture that fed dense populations for centuries. They created art, mathematics, astronomy, architecture that rivaled anything produced in the old world. They succeeded so well that they pushed their environment to its limits. When climate shifted, when those limits were exceeded, the fall was catastrophic precisely because the civilization was so complex, so specialized, so dependent on everything working perfectly. The Amazonians built thriving societies adapted to jungle environments Europeans still struggle to comprehend. Their failure came from outside, from pathogens they never had a chance to develop resistance to, from forces completely beyond their ability to understand or control. Now ask yourself, are we making the same mistakes? Our civilization is larger, more complex, more dependent on stable climate and functioning systems than any that came before. Our population is historically unprecedented. Our resource consumption pushes ecological boundaries. Our interconnected global systems mean local problems become worldwide cascades. We walk through jungle ruins and think ourselves immune to the patterns that created them. But the jungle remembers. And it's patient. Jungle cities tell only part of the story. While vegetation hides and preserves, the desert operates by different rules. It exposes, it mummifies, it transforms living cities into monuments of stone and sand. And in these harsh landscapes, some of the world's most spectacular lost cities have been waiting, their secrets baked into the very earth. In 1812, a Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt walked through the Jordanian desert dressed as an Arab traveller, speaking the language fluently, claiming to be searching for the tomb of Aaron. The disguise was necessary. Europeans weren't welcome in this region, and the secret he was pursuing required delicate deception. Local Bedouins had always known about the ruins in the narrow canyon. They called it Wadi Musa, the Valley of Moses, but they were protective of the location, wary of outsiders who might plunder what they considered sacred ground. Burckhardt's cover story worked. His guides led him through. The approach is theatrical in a way that seems deliberately designed. You enter through the Sikh, a natural canyon so narrow that sunlight barely penetrates, its walls rising 80 meters on either side. The passage winds for over a kilometer, each turn revealing nothing but more stone corridor. The walls are striated pink and orange and cream, layers of sandstone deposited over millions of years. Your eyes adjust to the dimness. The slot canyon feels endless. Then it opens. The treasury emerges like a hallucination, a facade carved directly into the cliff face, 2 stories of columns and pediments and intricate details sculpted from living rock. The stone glows pink in the desert light. It's called roseate, but that's inadequate. The colour shifts with the sun, moving through spectrums of coral and salmon and amber. This is Petra, not built, carved. Subtractive architecture, where the city was revealed by removing stone rather than stacking it. The Nabateans created this around 300 BCE. They were traders who controlled the crucial routes between Arabia and the Mediterranean. Spices from India, frankincense from southern Arabia, silk from China. Everything valuable that moved between east and west passed through Nabatean territory, and they taxed it all. The wealth was staggering, but Petra's real genius wasn't commerce. It was water. The city sits in one of the driest regions on Earth. Natural springs are rare. Rainfall is minimal. Yet the Nabateans engineered systems of channels, cisterns, and ceramic pipes that captured every drop, stored it, distributed it throughout the city. They transformed a desert canyon into a metropolis that housed 20,000 people at it. The cosmopolitan evidence is everywhere. Egyptian obelisks stand near Greek-style theatres carved into cliffsides. Roman columns frame doorways leading to chambers where Arabian gods were worshipped. Petra was where cultures collided and merged, where traders from a dozen nations conducted business in multiple languages. The decline came gradually, then suddenly. Rome discovered sea routes to India, bypassing the Arabian desert entirely. The caravans that had been Petra's lifeblood began choosing other paths. Revenue collapsed. Then in 363 CE, a massive earthquake destroyed much of the city's infrastructure, including the crucial water systems. Without water, without trade, the city couldn't sustain itself. People drifted away. The desert reclaimed what was left. But here's what should fascinate us more than the ruins we can see. Archaeologists estimate only 15% of Petra has been excavated. The treasury, the monastery, the royal tombs, these are just the obvious monuments. Most of the city remains buried beneath sand and debris. Ground-penetrating radar suggests structures we haven't begun to explore. Chambers sealed for 2,000 years. Districts where ordinary Nabateans lived their daily lives, still waiting beneath our feet. What's in the other 85%? Petra survived because it was carved from stone. But other desert cities weren't so permanent. Some thrived for centuries, then vanished so completely that even their locations became legend. And nowhere is this more dramatic than in the sands of the Arabian desert, where entire kingdoms disappeared beneath the dunes. The Quran mentions a city called Iram of the Pillars, destroyed by divine wrath for the arrogance of its people. The Arabian Nights describes a fabulously wealthy city swallowed by desert sands, its towers and marketplaces vanishing overnight. Medieval Arab geographers wrote about Ubar, a frankincense trading centre in the empty quarter, the Rubs al-Khali, one of the most desolate deserts on earth. C.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, became obsessed with finding this lost city. He studied ancient caravan routes, interviewed Bedouin traders, searched the sands. He never found it. By the 20th century, most scholars had concluded that Ubar was mythology, a metaphor, a composite of several real places transformed into legend. Then came Nicholas Clapp. In the 1980s, this amateur archaeologist and documentary filmmaker became convinced Ubar was real. He studied the ancient texts differently than his predecessors. Instead of looking for a magnificent city, he looked for function. Ubar had been a frankincense trading hub. That meant it needed to sit at the intersection of caravan routes. It needed water. It needed to be positioned where multiple paths from frankincense-producing regions converged before heading north toward Mediterranean markets. Clapp had access to something Lawrence never did: declassified NASA satellite imagery. The images showed something remarkable: subtle discolorations in the sand, barely visible, creating lines that converged. Ancient roads, their surfaces compacted differently than surrounding desert, creating variations in heat signature detectable from orbit. The tracks were invisible at ground level, erased by centuries of wind and sand. But from space, they appeared like ghost roads leading to a single point in southern Oman. In 1992, Clapp organised an expedition. The site was unpromising. A small, well used by Bedouin herders. Some stone ruins they assumed were from a relatively recent fort. But when excavation began, the ruins proved older and more complex than expected. They found a fortified octagonal structure with towers at each corner. Not massive, not sprawling, but sophisticated in its design. The pottery told a stunning story. Sherds from Syria, from Rome, from regions across the ancient world. This wasn't an isolated outpost. This was a crossroads where traders from multiple civilizations conducted business. The frankincense processing facilities confirmed it. Ubar had been exactly what the legends claimed, a hub for the frankincense trade. And frankincense, in the ancient world, was worth more than gold. It was burned in temples across the Mediterranean, used in burial preparations, prescribed as medicine. The demand was insatiable, the supply limited to a few regions in southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa. Controlling the trade meant controlling extraordinary wealth. But the excavation revealed something else, something that explained both why Ubar was lost and why the legend spoke of catastrophic destruction. The city had collapsed into the earth. Literally. Beneath Ubar lay a massive limestone cavern. For thousands of years, residents had drawn water from wells that tapped into this underground reservoir. But groundwater extraction in limestone creates cavities. The more water you remove, the larger the voids become. Eventually, the voids grow large enough that the stone roof can't support its own weight. Ubar's end came suddenly. The city centre collapsed into the cavern below, taking buildings, people, and the water source that had sustained the settlement. The survivors would have faced a choice between staying without water in the most hostile desert on Earth or leaving. They left. The irony is perfect and terrible. The resource that made Ubar wealthy, the water that allowed it to exist where no city should survive, was also what destroyed it. The city's success required intensive water extraction, undermined its foundation. The more it thrived, the closer it came to catastrophe. Archaeological work continues. Evidence suggests Ubar wasn't occupied just once but repeatedly over thousands of years. Settled, abandoned when conditions became impossible, resettled when circumstances improved. Each occupation layer tells a story of humans pushing survival to its absolute limits. Ubar collapsed into the earth, but other desert cities face a different fate. Not sudden catastrophe, but slow burial, grain by grain, until entire metropolises become hidden dunes. And in Egypt, despite centuries of excavation, the sand is still giving up its secrets. We've studied Egypt for 200 years, mapped the pyramids, catalogued the temples, excavated the Valley of the Kings of Heps, published thousands of papers, built entire museums around what we've found. Surely, by now, we know where everything is. Surely Egypt has no more lost cities to reveal? That assumption shatters regularly. In the year 2000, underwater archaeologist Frank Goddio was searching the seafloor off Egypt's northern coast near Alexandria. The Mediterranean had claimed significant coastline over the millennia, and Goddio suspected ancient settlements might lie beneath the waves. What he found was far more than settlements. Heracleion and Canopus, two major Egyptian cities that had slipped beneath the sea over 1,200 years ago. Not legends, not minor outposts, major urban centres that ancient texts mentioned repeatedly, but modern scholars couldn't locate because they'd been looking on land. The preservation was extraordinary. 64-foot statues lying on the seafloor, hundreds of smaller sculptures, their details sharp despite centuries underwater. Gold coins, jewellery, the remains of ancient ships, their wooden hulls protected by sediment. Temple complexes with columns still standing. Harbour facilities with anchors and loading equipment intact. Heracleion wasn't just another port. Before Alexandria was founded, Heracleion was Egypt's primary gateway to the Mediterranean. Pharaohs came here for coronation ceremonies. International trade flowed through its harbours. It was politically, economically and religiously significant, and we'd completely forgotten it existed. The sinking wasn't sudden catastrophe. It was gradual subsidence over centuries. The Nile Delta, where these cities stood, is geologically unstable. The sediment is water-saturated, prone to liquefaction during earthquakes. When seismic activity shook the region, the ground beneath the cities lost structural integrity. Buildings that had stood for centuries found themselves sinking. Rising sea levels and the delta's natural subsidence accelerated the process. Eventually, the Mediterranean reclaimed what had been shore. But underwater discoveries are only part of the story. In 2021, archaeologists working near Luxor announced something that changed contemporary understanding of Egyptian archaeology. They'd found an entire city preserved under sand. Not a necropolis, not a temple complex, a functioning urban centre dating to 3,400 years ago, from the reign of Amenhotep III. They called it the Lost Golden City. Egyptologists described it as the most important discovery since Tutankhamun's tomb. That's not hyperbole. The preservation was stunning. Bakeries with bread still visible in the ovens. Workshops with tools laid out as if the craftsman had just stepped away. administrative buildings with documents still readable, residential areas where the layout of homes told stories about social hierarchy and daily life, even jewellery left on tables, as if the inhabitants expected to return. The city wasn't destroyed. It was abandoned. But why? One theory points to Amenhotep III's son, the radical pharaoh Akhenaten, who moved the capital and imposed his revolutionary monotheistic religion. Perhaps this city, so associated with traditional worship and his father's reign, became inconvenient. Perhaps its abandonment was deliberate political statement. Or perhaps the reasons were more mundane: economic shifts, resource depletion, the slow decline that makes maintaining a large urban centre unsustainable. The archaeological evidence doesn't provide clear answers, only tantalising clues. Here's what should concern us more than any single discovery. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite surveys suggest dozens of unexcavated sites throughout Egypt, anomalies in the landscape that indicate buried structures, geophysical signatures consistent with ancient construction, promising locations that have never felt an archaeologist's trowel. The problem isn't lack of sites, it's excess. Egyptian archaeologists face an embarrassment of riches. Too many potential discoveries, insufficient resources to investigate them all. Funding is limited, trained personnel are scarce, political priorities shift, so choices must be made. Which sites get excavated? Which remain buried? Meanwhile, the threats multiply. Highway construction bulldozes through areas that might contain ruins. Urban expansion creeps into archaeological zones. Agricultural projects plough fields where cities might sleep. The race is between discovery and destruction is winning. Tourism creates its own problems. Millions of visitors annually generate revenue that funds preservation, but their presence also accelerates deterioration. Breath humidity damages painted tombs. Foot traffic erodes stone. Vibrations from tour buses destabilize ancient structures. The act of making sites accessible threatens their survival. Looting remains endemic. Antiquities fetch high prices on black markets. Organised criminal networks employ local diggers who know the landscape, who can recognise promising sites, who excavate at night and sell to international smugglers. Every object that appears in a private collection represents context destroyed, information lost forever. The desert provides both blessing and curse. Sand preserves what it buries, protecting structures from weathering and human interference. But that same sand makes sites invisible. Entire cities can lie beneath dunes, undetectable without sophisticated technology. And once detected, excavation is difficult, expensive, and slow. The irony is profound. Egypt is arguably the most studied ancient civilization in human history. We've been systematically exploring it since Napoleon's expedition in 1798. Museums worldwide hold Egyptian collections. Universities offer degrees in Egyptology. Thousands of scholars have dedicated careers to understanding this culture, yet we're still finding cities. If Egypt, with 2 centuries of intensive investigation, still harbours lost urban centres, what might remain undiscovered in regions where archaeological attention has been minimal? What cities lie beneath jungles, deserts or mountains in areas where political instability prevents research, where funding never reaches, where technology hasn't yet penetrated? Sand preserves what it buries. First, but what about water? When cities sink beneath the waves, do they vanish forever, or does the ocean keep its own archives? The answer lies in some of the most spectacular underwater discoveries ever made. Cities that didn't just collapse or get abandoned, but literally slipped beneath the sea. Since the Ice Age ended 11,000 years ago, the ocean has swallowed an area larger than the United States, 120 metres of sea level rise. Not gradually, not smoothly, but in pulses and surges as massive ice sheets collapsed, as meltwater poured into ocean basins, as coastlines that had been stable for millennia suddenly retreated inland at speeds humans couldn't outrun. Think about what that means for human history. The Mediterranean was smaller. Land bridges connected islands that are now separated by deep channels. Entire continental shelves that are currently underwater were dry land where people hunted, built settlements, raised families, and lived for thousands of years. Those landscapes are gone now, flooded and forgotten. Marine archaeologists call them submerged landscapes. They've identified hundreds of sites worldwide, from prehistoric settlements to classical era cities. Everyone tells the same story. That Humans have always gravitated toward coasts. The richest ecosystems, the easiest trade routes, the most abundant food sources all clustered near the meeting point of land and sea, which means when sea levels rose, we lost a disproportionate amount of human history. Underwater archaeology operates under constraints that make land excavation look simple by comparison. Visibility is limited. Even in clear water, you're working in a dimmed world where silt clouds every movement. Excavation is slow because everything must be documented photographically before being disturbed, and working in water makes even simple tasks exhausting. Equipment is expensive. Every dive is time-limited by decompression requirements. The sites face constant threats. Bottom-trawling fishing nets drag across the seafloor, destroying structures that survived millennia. Treasure hunters loot anything valuable they can carry. Ocean acidification from increased carbon dioxide gradually dissolves calcium-based materials like shells and certain stone types. Storms can bury sites under new sediment or expose them to destructive currents. But water also preserves what land destroys. Organic materials that would rot within years in terrestrial environments survive for thousands of years. Underwater, wood, leather, textiles. The everyday objects that rarely survive to tell us how ordinary people lived, sealed in sediment, protected from oxygen, they wait. Technology has revolutionized the field. Side-scan sonar creates acoustic images of the seafloor, revealing structures invisible to divers. Remotely operated vehicles explore depths where humans can't go, their cameras capturing footage from wrecks and ruins at extreme depths. Photogrammetry builds detailed three-dimensional models from thousands of photographs, allowing researchers to examine sites without disturbing them. The question that haunts the discipline is simple. How much have we lost? How much of human history is down there, unreachable, unknown? Consider the flood myths that appear in cultures worldwide. Noah and his ark, Gilgamesh escaping rising waters. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories describing lands that are now beneath the ocean. For generations, scholars treated these as metaphor or pure invention. But what if they're memories? When Ice Age glaciers melted, sea levels didn't rise uniformly. Some periods saw rapid increases, meters per century, fast enough that coastal communities would have watched their world drown within a single lifetime. Those experiences would have been traumatic enough to be preserved in oral tradition, passed down through generations, eventually becoming the flood myths we know today. Doggerland might be the most haunting example, a landscape the size of Britain that connected the island to continental Europe until about 6500 BCE. Stone Age people lived there, hunted mammoth and reindeer, fished in rivers that now lie beneath the North Sea. Rising seas flooded it gradually, then catastrophically during a massive underwater landslide that triggered a tsunami. The survivors would have fled to higher ground on what became the British Isles or mainland Europe, carrying stories of the world that drowned. If humanity's coastal settlements from prehistoric times are now underwater, our understanding of early civilization might be fundamentally incomplete. We're missing an entire chapter. The most successful settlements, the richest ecosystems, the first complex societies, potentially all beneath the waves. The theory is fascinating, but what about the reality? Have we actually found significant cities underwater? The answer is spectacular, and some of these discoveries have sparked controversies that persist to this day. Pavlopetri was a thriving city 5,000 years ago. Now it's a ghost town on the seafloor, its streets and buildings visible to divers who descend off the southern coast of Greece. Discovered in 1967 and extensively mapped with modern technology in 2009, Pavlopetri holds a distinction that makes it archaeologically precious. It's the world's oldest known submerged city, dating to around 3000 BCE. Bronze Age, contemporary with early Egyptian dynasties, with the construction of the first ziggurats in Mesopotamia. What makes Pavlopetri remarkable isn't just its age. It's its completeness. Most underwater sites suffer damage from currents, storms and time. Structures collapse. Streets become unrecognizable. The layout fragments, but Pavlopetri's street plan remains largely intact. You can trace the roads, identify individual buildings, see where courtyards opened onto thoroughfares, locate tombs and what appears to be a sophisticated water management system. The city lies in relatively shallow water between 3 and 4 meters deep, preserved by the sediment that covered it after submersion. The artifacts tell a story that challenges assumptions about Bronze Age Greek civilization. pottery from Crete, trade goods from Mesopotamia. Egyptian imports. This wasn't an isolated village. It was an organized urban center participating in long-distance Mediterranean trade networks. The sophistication suggests that Bronze Age societies were more interconnected, more complex, more advanced than scholars previously believed. The city likely sank due to earthquakes. The region is seismically active, prone to the kind of tectonic shifts that can drop coastal areas below sea level within seconds during major events. Gradual sea level rise probably contributed, making the settlement increasingly vulnerable until a final earthquake pushed it beneath the waves. The abandonment appears to have happened around 1000 BCE, though people may have continued visiting or salvaging the site for some time after it became partially submerged. Pavlopetri is archaeology without controversy. The evidence is clear. The dating is solid. International experts agree on its significance. But not all underwater cities generate such consensus. Off the coast of Dwarka in northwestern India, divers have documented large stone structures that some claim are the legendary city of Lord Krishna, described in Hindu epics like the Mahabharata. The texts say Dwarka was a magnificent city that sank into the sea after Krishna's death. For centuries, this was treated as pure mythology. Then underwater surveys found something. Stone structures arranged in patterns that could be building foundations. Walls constructed from cut stones. Pottery fragments that date to 1500 BCE or earlier. Artifacts suggesting human habitation. The discoveries sparked passionate debate that continues today. Proponents argue this is Dwarka, that the structures are clearly human-made, that the finds validate Hindu epics as historical records. The implications would be profound, similar to how Troy's discovery forced scholars to reconsider Homer. If the epics encoded real events and real places, what other myths are actually history? Skeptics are less convinced. Some geologists argue the structures could be natural rock formations. Underwater environments create shapes that resemble human construction. Beach rock, a type of sedimentary rock that forms in coastal areas, can create geometric patterns that look artificial. Distinguishing between natural and human-made becomes extremely difficult without extensive excavation and analysis. The controversy intersects with religion, national pride, and the standards of archaeological evidence. For Hindu believers, Dwarka's discovery would confirm the historical basis of sacred texts. For Indian nationalism, it would validate an indigenous civilization of great antiquity. For archaeologists, it requires proof that meets rigorous standards before claims can be accepted. The debate also highlights how underwater archaeology operates differently than land-based work. Natural processes create ambiguity. What looks like a wall might be fractured bedrock. What appears to be a courtyard might be a geological depression. Without the ability to examine structures closely, to excavate stratigraphically, to analyze construction techniques in detail, certainty remains elusive. Ongoing research continues. Dating of more samples, examination by international teams, attempts to determine whether the stones show evidence of quarrying and shaping which would prove human agency. But these processes take years, sometimes decades. Science moves slowly when the questions involve both empirical evidence and cultural identity. The lesson from Dwarka isn't that ancient texts are reliable or unreliable. It's that underwater discoveries exist in a space of uncertainty that land-based archaeology rarely encounters. The evidence is harder to access, harder to interpret, harder to verify. Pavlopetri and Dwarka raise fascinating questions, but they're relatively shallow sites, accessible to human divers. What about deeper waters? What about the ocean floors where human divers can't reach? That's where the most dramatic discoveries are being made, and where one of archaeology's greatest mysteries might finally be solved. Everyone's heard of Atlantis. Most think it's fantasy. But what if Plato wasn't describing one city but a pattern of catastrophes that humanity keeps forgetting? The story begins in 360 BCE, when the Greek philosopher Plato wrote two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, describing a magnificent island civilization that sank into the ocean in a single day and night of catastrophic destruction. For 2,000 years, people have argued about whether he was describing a real place or inventing a cautionary tale. Here's what gets overlooked in most discussions. Plato presented Atlantis explicitly as a morality tale about hubris and divine punishment. The story wasn't meant to be a historical record, but a philosophical argument about the dangers of imperial ambition and moral corruption. He dated the island's destruction to 9,000 years before his time around 9600 BCE, which would place it in the Stone Age, before any known advanced civilizations existed. And he described it as lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which his contemporaries would have understood as the Strait of Gibraltar, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. These details matter because they make Atlantis, as Plato described it, effectively impossible as literal history. Yet the story endures. Hundreds of books claim to have found the real Atlantis. Documentaries investigate new theories every year. The legend generates passionate belief despite zero confirmed physical evidence. Why? Because Atlantis represents something psychologically powerful, a perfect civilization destroyed by its own success. A cautionary tale about the impermanence of human achievement. The story resonates because every civilization fears it might be Atlantis brilliant, proud, and doomed. But some archaeological sites have made people wonder if Plato's fiction contained kernels of fact. Santorini, known in ancient times as Thera, is a volcanic island in the Aegean Sea. Around 1600 BCE, it experienced one of the most violent eruptions in human history. The explosion was so massive it created a caldera, a collapsed crater that now forms the island's distinctive crescent shape. Tsunamis generated by the eruption may have reached heights of 40 meters, devastating coastal settlements across the Mediterranean. The Minoan settlement of Akrotiri, buried under volcanic ash during this eruption, reveals what was lost. Multi-story buildings with advanced plumbing, stunning frescoes depicting sophisticated society, evidence of long-distance trade, urban planning that suggests complex governance. The preservation is remarkable, earning Akrotiri the nickname Pompeii of the Aegean. The parallels to Plato's Atlantis are striking. An advanced island civilization, sudden destruction by natural catastrophe, disappearance beneath the sea. Could Plato have based his story on distorted memories of Thera's destruction, passed down through centuries of oral tradition until the details became mythologized? The problems are chronological and geographical. Thera's eruption happened around 1200 years before Plato, not 9,000. It's in the Aegean, not beyond Gibraltar. And while the eruption was devastating, the island didn't sink entirely. It's still there, just reshaped. Other candidates have emerged. The Bimini Road, an underwater rock formation in the Bahamas that some claim shows evidence of human construction, has been largely discredited as natural beach rock. The Richat structure in Mauritania, a massive circular geological formation in the Sahara that matches Plato's description of concentric rings, is landlocked and has never been underwater. More speculative theories place Atlantis everywhere from Antarctica to the North Sea to Indonesia. Each theory reveals more about the theorist's assumptions than about actual history. European scholars tend to place Atlantis in the Mediterranean. American researchers favor locations in the Atlantic or Caribbean. The location migrates based on the researcher's cultural context. The broader pattern is revealing. Nearly every culture has myths of lost advanced civilizations. The Hindu tradition speaks of Dwarka and other submerged cities. Chinese legends describe kingdoms swallowed by the Taklamakan Desert. Aboriginal Australian stories tell of lands now underwater. Mesoamerican cultures have their own tales of previous worlds destroyed by floods or fire. Perhaps these stories fulfill a psychological need. They encode genuine memories of catastrophic events, coastal settlements flooded by rising seas, cities destroyed by volcanic eruptions or earthquakes, civilizations that collapsed. Over the generations, the specifics blur, but the emotional core remains. We remember that catastrophe happens, that civilizations fall, that the world we know can vanish. Or perhaps these myths express anxiety about our own civilization's fragility. By projecting destruction onto a mythical past, we process fears about our potential future. Here's the twist that should interest us most. Maybe the point isn't whether Atlantis was real. Maybe what matters is what the search reveals about us. The Atlantis legend has motivated countless explorations. It's driven technological innovation in underwater archaeological systems, submersibles, diving equipment, all developed partly because people wanted to find the lost city. It's forced archaeologists to reconsider how much ancient peoples knew and built, leading to genuine discoveries of sites that were dismissed as impossible. Whether Plato invented Atlantis from imagination or based it on garbled memories of real events, the story has shaped archaeology for 2 millennia. It's made us search, made us question, made us look more carefully at ancient texts and underwater landscapes. And the search continues. And the search continues. In 2022, researchers announced evidence of an ancient settlement on the Sicilian-Tunisian shelf that was submerged roughly 9,000 years ago. Time frame matches Plato's account, though the location doesn't. Every few years, someone claims a new discovery that might be Atlantis. We'll probably never find Plato's Atlantis because it likely never existed as he described it. But we'll keep finding real lost cities, real catastrophes, real civilizations that thrived and vanished. And each discovery teaches us something about the impermanence of human achievement. While oceans hide cities beneath water, other lost cities face different fates. In the world's coldest regions, ice and snow preserve settlements in ways that create archaeological time capsules. And in these frozen wastelands, we've made discoveries that challenge everything we thought we knew about how humans survived in extreme environments. 5,000 Europeans established thriving colonies in Greenland. Then they vanished. Every single person. The farms, churches and graves remain, but the people are gone. What happened? The story begins in 985 CE with Eric the Red, a Norse explorer banished from Iceland for murder. He sailed west and discovered a land of fjords and valleys. The name he chose for this place was brilliant marketing. Greenland. He wanted to attract settlers, and who would move to a place called harsh, frozen, barely survivable land? Greenland sounded promising, verdant, full of possibility. Remarkably, the strategy worked. Settlers came. They established two main colonies, the eastern and western settlements, which at their peak around 1300 CE housed roughly 5,000 Norse inhabitants. They built churches, farms and trading posts. They even had a bishop, maintaining their connection to the Catholic Church and European Christian civilization. Archaeological evidence shows they traded walrus ivory, polar bear hides, and narwhal tusks back to Europe, luxury goods that fetched high prices in Scandinavian and continental markets. For nearly 500 years, they endured. That's longer than European settlement has existed in most of the Americas. This wasn't a failed colony. It was a successful one that somehow ended. The last documented contact was a marriage record in 1408. After that, silence. Ships stopped coming. Letters stopped arriving. Numbing. When expeditions finally investigated in the late 1500s, they found abandoned farms, empty churches, and no living Norse inhabitants. Just ruins and questions. The archaeological evidence is haunting in its ordinariness. Houses with furniture still arranged as if the occupants expected to return. Farming tools left in place, not stolen or salvaged, but simply abandoned. Churches with their altars intact, graveyards where Norse and indigenous Greenlandic people are buried side by side, suggesting some level of cultural mixing, intermarriage or at least peaceful coexistence toward the end. So what went wrong? The Little Ice Age began around 1300 CE. Temperatures dropped across the North Atlantic, growing seasons shortened, winters became longer and more brutal. The Norse colonists had established farms based on European agricultural practice, cattle, sheep, grain cultivation. These techniques worked during the medieval warm period when they first arrived, but became increasingly untenable as the climate cooled. Meanwhile, their primary trade, good walrus ivory, faced new competition. African elephant ivory began flooding European markets, undercutting prices. The economic foundation of the settlements weakened. They had less to trade, which meant fewer supplies from Europe, which meant greater isolation. The indigenous Thule people, ancestors of modern Inuit, were expanding into Greenland during this period. Some evidence suggests conflict. Other evidence suggests cooperation. The reality was probably complex, varying by location and time. But the Thule had something. The Norse didn't specialized Arctic survival technology, seal hunting techniques, kayaks for water travel, warmer clothing made from animal skins. They thrived in conditions that were killing the Norse. Recent skeletal analysis reveals the grim progression. Malnutrition markers appear with increasing frequency. Stature decreases over generation, a classic sign of chronic childhood food stress. Isotope analysis of bones shows dietary changes. They were eating less grain, more fish and seals, suggesting they were adopting some fuel practices but perhaps too late or too incompletely. Evidence of desperation appears in the archaeological record. Farming techniques that strip soil fertility, suggesting they were pushing their land beyond sustainable limits. Hunting of juvenile animals, indicating that prey populations had crashed and hunters were taking whatever they could find regardless of long-term consequences. Here's the chilling realization. The Norse didn't vanish suddenly. They starved slowly, struggled gradually, watched their world contract year by year. Some may have died, some may have sailed away if ships still came, some probably assimilated into Thule communities, choosing survival over cultural identity. The last Norse Greenlanders likely knew their civilization was ending. They saw it coming. The question is whether they understood why they were failing while the Thule were succeeding. The Thule had adapted to Arctic conditions over millennia. The Norse clung to European farming identity. They were Viking farmers, and giving that up meant ceasing to be who they believed they were. Pride killed them, or more precisely, the inability to transform identity when survival demanded it. The Thule survived. The Norse vanished. Both groups faced the same environment. Only one adapted. Greenland's Norse vanished because they couldn't adapt to a changing climate. But other Arctic settlements succeeded for centuries, leaving behind frozen archaeological treasures that preserved details lost everywhere else. And in Siberia, the permafrost has begun revealing secrets that rewrite our understanding of ancient human resilience. Climate change is destroying archaeological sites, but it's also revealing them perfectly preserved cities, camps, and graves frozen for 10,000 years. The ice is our enemy and our greatest ally. Permafrost that has remained frozen since the end of the last ice age is thawing. In Siberia, Alaska, and northern Canada, ancient landscapes are emerging from ice that held them for millennia. With them come the people who lived there, their possessions, their food, their secrets, all preserved in ways impossible anywhere else on Earth. Ice is the perfect preservative. Organic materials that would decompose within days in normal conditions survive indefinitely when frozen. Wood retains its grain patterns. Leather remains supple. Textiles keep their colours. Even human tissue can persist, mummified by cold, skin and tattoos intact after thousands of years. The discoveries are stunning. Viking shipwrecks emerging from melting ice in Greenland with ropes coiled exactly as sailors left them, wooden planks showing tool marks from their construction. Scythian burial mounds in Siberia opening to reveal textiles woven 2,500 years ago, leather boots still recognizable, and human remains so well preserved that tattooed skin displays intricate animal designs, permanent art that survived when the person wearing it couldn't. Zhukov Island in the East Siberian Sea holds settlements dating back 9,000 years. The permafrost preserved evidence of sophisticated Arctic survival strategies that challenge assumptions about Stone Age capabilities. Dog sledding equipment, the earliest confirmed evidence of domesticated dogs used for transportation, hunting tools designed specifically for Arctic prey, storage systems for preserving meat through long winters. These weren't primitive people struggling to survive. They were specialists who had mastered one of Earth's harshest environments. The Ice Maiden of the Altai Mountains might be the most spectacular individual discovery. A Scythian noblewoman buried 2,500 years ago in a tomb that flooded and froze, creating perfect preservation conditions. Her body revealed details archaeologists rarely get to see. Elaborate tattoos covering her arms, mythical creatures rendered in permanent ink, clothing made from silk that travelled thousands of miles along ancient trade routes. Evidence of cannabis use, either medicinal or ritual. Even the contents of her last meal preserved in her digestive system. Mammoth kill sites appear with regularity as permafrost thaws. Bones showing butchery marks. Stone tools left where hunters dropped them after the work was done. These sites reveal how Paleolithic humans took down creatures weighing several tons using nothing but coordination, patience, and weapons tipped with sharpened stone. But the revelations come with urgent complications. When permafrost thaws, organic material immediately begins degrading. Wood starts rotting. Leather dries and cracks. Textiles fall apart. Sites that survived 10,000 years intact can disappear within a single summer once exposed to air and warmth. Archaeologists face impossible choices about which sites to excavate, which to document, which to leave, because there simply aren't enough people or resources to save everything. Indigenous communities confront painful decisions. These are their ancestors emerging from the ice. Graves that were hidden and protected by permafrost are now exposed. Should archaeologists excavate? Should the remains be reburied? Who decides? The consultation process is necessary and delicate, balancing scientific interest against cultural respect and indigenous sovereignty. The permafrost is melting faster than anyone can respond. For every site that gets excavated, dozens more emerge and degrade unstudied. We're losing data at a rate that makes the race feel futile. Climate change is providing a brief window, maybe a few decades, during which we can glimpse what was frozen. Then it will be gone forever, decomposed, washed away, lost again, but this time permanently. The irony is complete. The same process destroying these sites is revealing them. Without climate change, they'd remain frozen and undiscovered. But climate change ensures that most will be destroyed before we ever know they existed. What these frozen discoveries reveal matters. Humans have always been adaptable. We've survived in environments that seem impossible, from Arctic tundra to desert extremes. Ancient peoples weren't less capable than us. They were differently specialized, their knowledge suited to their circumstances. Arctic populations developed technologies that wouldn't be improved upon for thousands of years. They weren't primitive. They weren't primitive. They were experts, and ancient climate changes have always forced migration, adaptation, and innovation. The difference now is speed and scale. Past climate shifts happened over centuries or millennia. Current changes are happening within lifetimes. Adaptation is still possible, but the time frame is compressing. Frozen cities and camps show us human resilience in the face of extreme cold. But what about heat? What about cities that humans abandoned not because they couldn't survive, but because they chose to leave? The world's most mysterious lost cities weren't destroyed. They were walked away from by people who simply decided enough, and understanding why might be the most unsettling revelation of all. Most lost cities weren't destroyed. They were abandoned by people who simply decided to leave. What makes a city worth staying in? And when is it too late to save one? The pattern appears across continents and centuries. Cities that weren't conquered, weren't burned, weren't buried by volcanic ash, just emptied. The people walked away. They took what they could carry and left everything else behind. Buildings, infrastructure, centuries of accumulated knowledge embedded in the physical structure of urban life. What would it take for you to abandon your city, to decide that staying is worse than leaving everything familiar behind? Archaeological evidence reveals that abandonment is rarely sudden. Buildings show different states of repair and decay across the same site. Some neighbourhoods empty first while others hold on longer. Wealthy districts often show signs of earlier departure than poor areas' lights leave first, taking their resources and skills, breaking the social contracts that held communities together. Their flight accelerates the decline for those who remain. Archaeologists call this threshold effects. Cities can absorb tremendous stress, drought, disease, warfare, economic decline. Each problem is manageable in isolation, but stresses compound. A city dealing with drought can survive if trade continues. A city facing economic problems can adapt if water remains reliable. But when multiple problems converge, when one more crisis hits a system already strained to its limits, collapse can be sudden and total. The cascading failures follow predictable patterns. Water systems fail, so farmers leave. Without farmers, markets empty. Without markets, craftspeople have no one to trade with. Without craftspeople, builders have no materials. Without builders, infrastructure decays. Each departure makes the city less viable for those who remain, creating a self-reinforcing spiral toward abandonment. But perhaps the most devastating losses are intangible. When religious systems fail to explain suffering, when priests can't bring rain, when sacrifices to gods produce no results, people lose faith in the institutions that bind communities. When political authority crumbles because leaders can't deliver security or justice, the shared beliefs that make urban cooperation possible evaporate. A city without shared meaning is just a collection of buildings occupied by strangers who happen to live near each other. The archaeological signatures tell the story. Partially dismantled structures suggest people took valuable materials when they left roof timbers, door frames, anything that could be salvaged for use elsewhere. Pottery becomes simpler over time, indicating loss of specialized craftspeople who knew how to create elaborate wares. Trade goods disappear from the record, showing economic networks breaking down. Sometimes we get hints about where people went when pottery styles from abandoned cities appear in neighbouring regions, evidence of refugees integrating into new communities. So what makes a city worth staying in? The archaeology suggests it's not just physical resources. Water matters, but so does functioning governance. Food matters, but so do markets where people can trade. Shelter matters, but so does the belief that tomorrow will be better than today. Cities are held together as much by hope and social trust as by walls and aqueducts. When those intangibles erode, when enough people stop believing in the city's future, the physical infrastructure becomes irrelevant. Buildings can stand for centuries after the city as a living entity has died. We see this pattern repeating in modern times. Rust Belt cities losing populations despite intact infrastructure. Climate refugees abandoning coastal settlements before the water actually rises. Communities dissolving when industries that sustained them close. Cities are consensus agreements. When enough people decide to leave, the city ceases to exist regardless of whether buildings remain standing. But not all cities are abandoned gradually. Some vanish suddenly, not because of earthquakes or climate, but because of human choices. War, politics and power have created some of the most dramatic abandonments in history. And nowhere is this more evident than in the cities humans deliberately destroyed or left to prove a point. Angkor was the largest pre-industrial city on Earth, bigger than Paris, London or Constantinople. Then the Khmer people simply walked away. Why would you abandon perfection? The scale is difficult to comprehend. This wasn't a single city, but an urban complex covering over 1,000 square kilometres. At its peak in the 13th century, it housed possibly 1 million people. To put that in perspective, no European city approached even half that population. Angkor was a metropolitan achievement that wouldn't be matched in the West for centuries. The centrepiece, Angkor Wat, remains the largest religious monument in the world. But that temple is just the most visible element of something far more sophisticated. Angkor was a hydraulic city. Its power and population depended entirely on a massive water management infrastructure reservoirs called barrays, some kilometres across, connected by networks of canals and moats that controlled monsoon flooding, stored water for dry seasons, and irrigated rice fields year-round. The engineering was extraordinary. The system captured rainwater during monsoons, distributed it to agricultural zones during dry periods, and managed flows to prevent flooding while maximising cultivation. This hydraulic mastery allowed Angkor to support population densities that would have been impossible otherwise. The city worked because the water system worked. Urban planning was equally sophisticated. Residential areas, markets, administrative centres and religious complexes were carefully organised. Evidence suggests zoning, infrastructure maintenance and governance capable of coordinating millions of person-hours of labour. This wasn't accidental growth, it was deliberate urban design. Then, by the mid-15th century, it was largely deserted. The Khmer court relocated to Phnom Penh. Unlike many lost cities, Angkor's abandonment appears in historical records, yet the reasons remain debated. The hydraulic hypothesis suggests the water system became unsustainable. Centuries of use created problems. Sedimentation gradually filled reservoirs, reducing capacity. Canal maintenance became increasingly expensive as the infrastructure aged. Climate changes megadroughts, alternating with extreme monsoon stressed the system beyond its design limits. What had once been engineering triumph became engineering liability. When the water system failed, the city that depended on it couldn't survive. The warfare theory points to external pressure. The Ayutthaya kingdom from what is now Thailand launched repeated attacks. In 1430, they sacked Angkor, dealing a devastating blow to the city's prestige and security. Perhaps the court decided that defending an inland capital against maritime powers was unsustainable. The trade shift hypothesis suggests economics. Maritime trade was becoming increasingly important in Southeast Asia. Coastal cities offered better access to international commerce. Angkor's inland location, once advantageous for controlling agricultural hinterlands, became a disadvantage when wealth flowed through ports rather than rice fields. Perhaps the merchant class and court recognised that the future lay elsewhere. Likely, all three factors converged. The hydraulic system was failing, external threats were increasing. Economic logic favoured relocation. Once the elite began leaving, cascading failures would have accelerated the process. Recent LiDAR surveys revolutionized understanding. The city was even larger than archaeologists thought, with suburbs, temples and infrastructure extending far beyond visible ruins. But the surveys also revealed something important. The abandonment wasn't complete. A smaller population continued living in the area even after the court left, maintaining temples and practicing Buddhism. Angkor as a capital died. Angkor as a settlement persisted. The archaeological evidence is haunting. Temples that were never finished, construction halted mid-project, suggesting economic problems emerged before the final abandonment. Statues deliberately defaced, indicating religious conflict or iconoclasm, perhaps as Buddhism replaced Hinduism in popular practice. And evidence that the jungle reclaimed the city with remarkable speed, root systems invading buildings within decades, transforming urban spaces into forest within a century. When French explorer Henri Mouhot documented Angkor in 1860, he claimed to have discovered it. Local Khmer people who had always known about the ruins must have found this amusing. The temples had never been completely abandoned. Buddhist monks still maintained them. Villages still visited. But to the outside world, particularly Europe, Angkor was lost. Today, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site visited by millions annually. A lost city that was found. A capital that became a ruin that became a tourist attraction. The full circle of forgetting and remembering. Angkor's abandonment took decades, a gradual transition from capital to memory. But other cities vanished much faster, not because their systems failed, but because powerful people decreed it. When rulers decide a city must die, it can disappear almost overnight. Emperor Akbar built the perfect capital. Stunning architecture. Religious tolerance. Strategic location. 14 years later, he abandoned it. The city still stands, empty, as if waiting for him to return. Fatehpur Sikri is remarkably preserved. Unlike cities reclaimed by jungle or buried by sand, this Mughal capital stands largely intact. Red sandstone buildings glow in the Indian sun. Courtyards remain defined. Palaces and mosques look as if their inhabitants simply walked out yesterday and never came back. The architecture reflects Akbar's vision. Islamic arches merge with Hindu pillars. Persian design elements blend with local Indian traditions. This wasn't cultural confusion. It was deliberate synthesis, a physical manifestation of Akbar's belief in religious harmony and cultural integration. The buildings feature intricate carved details, elegant proportions, and sophisticated cooling systems designed for India's intense heat. Wind catchers channel breezes through living spaces. Water features create evaporative cooling. The design anticipates modern passive climate control by centuries. The royal complex includes the Buland Darwaza, the Gate of Victory, one of the largest gateways in the world. Standing before it, you feel the scale of Akbar's ambition. This wasn't a modest project. This was a statement about empire, about power, about possibility. Akbar built Fatehpur Sikri for specific reasons. The location sat near the shrine of Sufi Saint Sheikh Salim Chishti. Akbar credited the saint's blessings for finally giving him sons and heirs after years of desperate longing. The spiritual significance mattered deeply. Additionally, the location was strategically positioned. And perhaps most importantly, Akbar wanted a capital that represented his vision of religious harmony, something neither Agra nor Delhi could fully embody because they carried too much historical weight. So he built from scratch. The only Mughal emperor to create an entirely new capital rather than expanding existing settlements. Fatehpur Sikri was pure expression of his ideals, uncompromised by prior architecture or established power structures. After just 14 years, he left, moved his court back to Agra. Fatehpur Sikri never regained status as permanent capital. The traditional explanation points to water shortage, simple, definitive, satisfying in its clarity, but probably too simplistic. Recent studies complicate the narrative. Water wasn't critically scarce. The city had wells and reservoirs. While not abundant, water supply appears adequate for the population. Other factors likely mattered more. Military campaigns in the northwest required Akbar's presence in Lahore. Fatehpur Sikri's central location became a liability when the emperor needed to project power toward Afghanistan and the frontier provinces. Geography made the capital inconvenient for military administration. Some historians point to practical problems. The city sits on a stone platform, visually impressive but potentially problematic. Drainage may have been inadequate. Monsoons could have caused flooding that made the city uncomfortable or even dangerous during rainy seasons. A capital that becomes partially uninhabitable several months each year isn't ideal regardless of its beauty. Others suggest political factors. Fatehpur Sikri may have become too identified with specific religious and cultural factions. As Akbar's empire expanded and required managing diverse populations, a capital so closely associated with particular beliefs might have created political complications. Moving back to Agra, with its more neutral historical identity, may have been strategic calculation rather than admission of failure. The poignancy lies in the gap between vision and reality. Akbar imagined a perfect capital embodying his ideals. He had the resources, the architectural expertise, the political will to build it exactly as he wanted. Yet somehow the vision didn't work. The perfect city failed to function as a permanent capital. Later, Mughals briefly reoccupied Fatehpur Sikri but never restored it to primary status. It became a curiosity, a ghost town that visitors could walk through like a museum, wondering what went wrong. Today, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The preservation that made it architecturally remarkable also makes it pedagogically valuable. Fatehpur Sikri teaches us that cities aren't just physical infrastructure. They're complex social, political and economic ecosystems. Multiple elements must function simultaneously. Order, location, political symbolism, military convenience, social acceptance, economic viability. If any critical element fails, even the most carefully planned, beautifully executed city becomes an empty shell. Buildings can be perfect while cities fail. The structures endure while the urban life they were meant to house vanishes. Akbar abandoned Fatehpur Sikri for complex reasons, military, political, practical. But some cities are abandoned for a single, devastating reason: ideology. When belief systems change, the cities built to honour old gods can become inconvenient reminders of abandoned faiths, and nowhere is this more dramatic than in the brief, strange story of Amarna. A pharaoh built an entire city to worship his one true god. 20 years later, Egypt pretended it never existed. What happens when cities become inconvenient memories? Around 1350 BCE, Pharaoh Amenhotep IV did something that shocked Egyptian civilization to its core. In a culture that had worshipped dozens of gods for thousands of years, he declared there was only one god, the Aten, the sun disk. Everything else, Amun, Osiris, Isis, the entire pantheon that had sustained Egyptian religion since before the pyramids, was false. He changed his own name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. Then he began dismantling the religious infrastructure of an empire. Traditional temples closed. Priesthoods that had accumulated wealth and influence for centuries were disbanded. Images of other deities were defaced, especially Amun, who had been king of gods. The changes were radical, swift, and deeply unsettling to a civilization built on religious continuity. But Akhenaten's most dramatic move was geographic. He abandoned Thebes, Egypt's traditional capital, and built an entirely new city in virgin desert. Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. Modern archaeologists call it Amarna. The location was deliberate, unconstrained by existing structures or political compromises. Akhenaten could design his capital exactly as his theology demanded. The layout oriented toward sunrise, toward the daily rebirth of his one god. The great Aten temple stood open to the sky, fundamentally different from traditional, enclosed Egyptian temples where only priests could access the divine. Artistic styles changed dramatically. Egyptian art had always idealized human forms, showing pharaohs as perfectly proportioned, eternally youthful. Amarna art abandoned this convention. Akhenaten appears with elongated skull, prominent belly, narrow shoulders. The depictions are realistic, even unflattering. Whether this reflected actual appearance or symbolic representation remains debated, but the break from tradition was absolute. The city grew rapidly. Estimates suggest 20,000 to 50,000 inhabitants, nobility, craftsmen, labourers relocated from across Egypt. Some came willingly, drawn by royal patronage and opportunity. Others probably had little choice. Archaeological excavations reveal the contradictions. Tombs contain inscriptions proclaiming Akhenaten's ideology in elaborate detail. Workshops show artistic production focused entirely on Aten worship. But workers' housing tells a grimmer story. Cramped conditions, evidence of malnutrition in skeletal remains, injuries suggesting harsh labour. While elites enjoyed luxury and spacious villas, those who actually built the city suffered. Social tensions likely simmered beneath the revolutionary surface. Then Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE after a 17-year reign. His young successor, originally named Tutankhaten, quickly restored traditional gods. He changed his own name to Tutankhamun, removing any reference to the Aten. The capital moved back to Thebes. Amarna was abandoned within a few years. Not gradually, not carefully. People simply left, walking away from homes, workshops, temples. Later pharaohs went further. They systematically erased Akhenaten from history. His cartouches were defaced. His name was excluded from king lists. When forced to reference him, they called him the criminal or the heretic. For 3,000 years, the erasure was remarkably successful. Akhenaten vanished from historical memory. Modern archaeology rediscovered Amarna in the 19th century. Because it was abandoned so quickly and never reoccupied, it provides something rarely a snapshot of Egyptian daily life frozen in time. Most Egyptian sites were continuously inhabited, with centuries of rebuilding obliterating earlier periods. Amarna stands alone, a moment preserved by abandonment. The irony is profound. Akhenaten tried to achieve immortality through religious revolution. His enemies succeeded in erasing his memory. The city he built to honor his god became evidence of what happens when ideology conflicts with tradition, when one person's vision becomes everyone else's burden. Cities built on ideology rather than practical need are fragile. When the ideology fails or becomes inconvenient, the city can be abandoned as quickly as it was built. Amarna existed for barely 20 years. The desert reclaimed what the desert had yielded. Ancient pharaohs could erase cities they didn't like. But in the modern world, abandonment happens for different reasons. It's not ideology, but economics, politics, and catastrophe. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, entire cities have become ghost towns in living memory, creating a new kind of lost city that we actually watched disappear. In 1986, a city of 50,000 people was abandoned in a single day. Nothing was destroyed. The buildings still stand. The apartments remain furnished. The schools hold textbooks open on desks, but no one can live there. And no one ever will again. This is Pripyat, and it forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. How did the modern world create its own lost city? Most abandoned places we have explored together were ancient. Their populations vanished across centuries, their stones weathered by millennia. But Pripyat is different. This was not a city of the distant past. It was founded in 1970, just 16 years before its death. The people who lived there are still alive today, scattered across Ukraine and beyond, carrying memories of homes they can never reclaim. Pripyat was built to house workers at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and Soviet planners designed it as a model city, wide boulevards lined with trees, modern apartment blocks with central heating, a hospital, a cinema, schools filled with children. Nearly 50,000 residents lived there, and they believed they were building the future. A brand new amusement park was scheduled to open on May 1st, 1986. The Ferris wheel stood ready, painted bright yellow, waiting to carry its first passengers into the Ukrainian sky. It never did. On April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl plant exploded. The blast tore through the building and released massive clouds of radioactive material into the atmosphere. It was the worst nuclear disaster in history, and the city of Pripyat sat just 3 kilometers away. But here is what makes the story even more haunting. The authorities knew the danger immediately, and they said nothing. For nearly 36 hours, the people of Pripyat continued their lives while invisible poison drifted through their streets. Children played outside. Families hung laundry on balconies. Some residents even gathered on a railway bridge to watch the strange glow coming from the destroyed reactor, not understanding they were staring directly at lethal radiation. Finally, on April 27th, the evacuation order came, but officials still concealed the severity. Residents were told to prepare for a temporary absence of 3 days. Take only essentials, they said. Leave your belongings. You will return soon. Buses arrived by the hundreds, and within a few hours the entire population of Pripyat was transported away. The city fell silent, and those 50,000 people never came home. What they left behind is unlike anything else on Earth. Pripyat is not a ruin. It is a time capsule frozen in 1986. Apartments still hold personal belongings on shelves. Kitchens display Soviet-era dishes. In the schools, gas masks litter the floors, distributed during the evacuation and then discarded. The amusement park stands untouched, its Ferris wheel rusting slowly, bumper cars scattered where workers abandoned them, and through all of it, nature has crept back in. Trees now grow through apartment buildings, their roots splitting concrete floors. Vines climb the walls of the hospital. Wolves roam streets that once held traffic. Wild horses graze in overgrown courtyards. European bison, an endangered species, have returned to the exclusion zone. In the absence of humans, despite the radiation, life has flourished in ways scientists never predicted. This is the strange paradox of Pripyat. It remains contaminated, yet it has become an accidental nature reserve. Some areas register relatively low radiation today. Others remain extremely dangerous, invisible hotspots where contamination lingers in soil and objects. Since 2011, guided tours have been permitted, though visitors must follow strict protocols and time limits. Taking anything from Pripyat is illegal and genuinely hazardous. The souvenirs people might want to carry home could carry radiation with them for decades. Former residents sometimes return on these tours, standing outside apartments they once called home, unable to enter, unable to stay, carrying grief for a life that ended in a single afternoon. Their memories remain vivid, the city remains visible, but the distance between the two can never be crossed. Pripyat teaches us something we prefer not to believe. Modern cities are just as vulnerable as ancient ones. Our technology has not made us immune to catastrophe. It has simply given us new ways to create lost cities of our own. But Pripyat was lost to disaster, a single accident that made an entire city uninhabitable overnight. Other modern cities have been abandoned more gradually, hollowed out by economic forces rather than radiation. And in the industrial heartland of America, dozens of cities are experiencing a slow-motion version of the same vanishing. American cities that once built cars, steel and rubber for the entire world are now losing 60% of their populations. They are not being buried by volcanic ash or abandoned to radiation. They are simply emptying, block by block, year after year. We are creating lost cities in real time, and we can watch it happen, but we seemingly cannot stop it. Detroit reached its peak in 1950 with 1.8 million residents. By 2020, fewer than 650,000 remained. More than 60% of the population had vanished over 7 decades. Youngstown, Ohio tells the same story. So does Gary, Indiana. These were not small towns. They were industrial powerhouses, cities that forged the steel and assembled the automobiles that built modern America. Now their neighborhoods stand empty and their factories rust under grey Midwestern skies. What does this look like from the ground? Entire city blocks where every house is abandoned, windows boarded or broken, roofs caving inward. Streets that once held families now hold only grass pushing through cracked pavement. Skyscrapers in downtown cores standing hollow, their lobbies silent, their upper floors home only to pigeons. Schools that educated generations of children now shuttered and surrounded by chain-link fencing. In some neighborhoods, the abandonment is so complete that the land is reverting to prairie, as if the city itself is being slowly digested by the earth. The causes are complicated and painful. Manufacturing moved overseas or relocated to states without strong unions. Automation reduced the number of workers needed in factories that remained. The oil crisis of the 1970s hit the automobile industry hard, and foreign competition finished what the crisis started. White flight pulled wealth and tax revenue into suburbs, leaving city centers starved of resources. Racial segregation and discriminatory housing policies concentrated poverty in specific neighborhoods. And when the financial crisis of 2008 triggered waves of foreclosures, entire communities that had held on for decades finally collapsed. The human cost is measured in generations. Families who spent lifetimes in these cities watched their communities disintegrate around them. Retirees who planned to sell their homes and fund their final years discovered those homes had lost all value. Children grew up surrounded by decay, learning to see their cities as synonyms for failure rather than pride. The psychological weight of this slow abandonment is different from sudden catastrophe, but no less heavy. Some cities have tried innovative responses. Detroit offered houses for $1, hoping to attract new residents willing to rebuild. Other cities engaged in what planners call right-sizing, demolishing abandoned areas rather than maintaining infrastructure for populations that no longer exist. Urban farms have sprouted in empty lots. Artists have transformed vacant buildings into galleries and studios. But these efforts often create small islands of revival, surrounded by vast seas of continued decline. And gentrification in revitalized neighborhoods sometimes displaces the very residents who survived the hardest years. Here is a question that sounds strange but deserves consideration. What will these abandoned neighborhoods look like in 100 years, in 500? Will future archaeologists excavate the ruins of 20th century America the way we now explore Pompeii or Angkor Wat? Will they sift through the rubble of Detroit factories and wonder what economic forces could empty a city of over 1 million people? The uncomfortable truth is that we are creating our own lost cities through economic abandonment. The pattern is identical to ancient examples. When cities lose their economic purpose and cannot adapt, people leave. The speed is different, measured in decades rather than centuries, but the outcome is the same: empty streets, crumbling buildings, silence where there was once life. Some argue these cities are not lost but transforming, that abandonment is adaptation rather than failure. Perhaps that is true. Perhaps the cities that emerge from this contraction will be stronger, more sustainable, better suited to a changed economy. Or perhaps we are simply watching the slow death of places that once mattered, unable to save them, unable to look away. America's industrial cities are losing population gradually over decades, but some modern places face even faster abandonment, entire communities built for single purposes that vanish completely when that purpose ends. Welcome to the world of ghost towns and company towns, places that were built to die. Some cities are designed to die, not abandoned by accident, catastrophe, or gradual decline, but built with expiration dates written into their foundations. Constructed around mines that will empty, industries that will relocate, resources that will inevitably run dry. These places bloom spectacularly and vanish just as fast, and they force us to wonder, are we living in the ghost towns of tomorrow? The pattern repeats across continents and centuries. A valuable resource is discovered. Workers flood in. Towns materialize almost overnight, complete with houses, shops, saloons, and schools. Optimism runs high. Fortunes are made, and then the ore runs out. The timber is exhausted. The well goes dry. Without economic diversity, there is no reason to stay. Within months, sometimes weeks, bustling communities become silent monuments to vanished prosperity. Body, California, once held 10,000 people during the gold rush of the 1880s. Miners worked the hills, merchants lined the streets, and the town roared with ambition. Today, Body is a state historic park, its wooden buildings preserved in a state of arrested decay. Visitors walk streets where no one has lived for generations, peering through windows at rooms frozen in departure. Centralia, Pennsylvania, tells an even stranger story. This was a coal town, established in 1866, home to generations of mining families. Then, in 1962, a fire started in the coal seam beneath the town. It has never stopped burning. For over 6 decades, the underground fire has spread through miles of tunnels, venting toxic gases and causing the ground itself to collapse without warning. The government relocated residents, condemned buildings, and removed Centralia from maps. Today, fewer than 10 people remain in a town that once held over 1,000. Smoke still rises from cracks in the roads, and the earth stays warm even in winter. Hashima Island in Japan represents perhaps the most visually striking example, known as Gunkanjima, or Battleship Island. This tiny rock was transformed into a vertical city to house coal miners. Space was so limited that apartment blocks rose to 9 stories, creating a dense concrete fortress in the middle of the sea. At its peak, 5,000 people lived on an island smaller than 15 acres, making it one of the most densely populated places on Earth. When the coal industry declined, the mine closed in 1974. The entire population left within months. Today, Hashima stands abandoned, its concrete towers crumbling into the Pacific, a ghost ship that will never sail. Modern versions of this pattern continue to emerge. Military bases close, and the towns that served them wither. Olympic villages built for 2 weeks of competition become expensive white elephants. In China, entire cities have been constructed in anticipation of urbanization waves that never arrived, their apartment towers standing empty, their shopping malls echoing with silence. Why do people build cities with inherent expiration dates? The answers are uncomfortable. Immediate profit outweighs long-term planning. Investors expect to leave before collapse. Workers need housing near the work, regardless of how long that work will last. And sometimes people simply believe that alternatives will emerge, that the mine will reveal new veins, that other industries will arrive. They rarely do. A strange industry has grown around these failures. Dark tourism draws thousands to Pripyat, Hashima, Bodhi, and hundreds of similar sites. People travel specifically to experience human absence, to walk through the ruins of optimism, to feel the weight of abandoned dreams. There is something magnetic about these places, something that speaks to fears we rarely voice. Consider this. Many thriving cities today are effectively company towns, their economies dominated by single corporations or industries. What happens when those corporations fade? When the technology shifts? When the next disruption arrives? Seattle, San Francisco, Austin, and dozens of other places have tied their futures to companies that did not exist 50 years ago. Will they still exist 50 years from now? We have seen cities lost to jungle, desert, water, ice, ideology, catastrophe, and economics. But the most important question remains: how do we actually find these lost cities? How does a pile of stones in the wilderness become identified as a forgotten metropolis? The answer involves detective work, cutting-edge technology, and sometimes nothing but sheer luck. Lost cities are hiding in plain sight. Hills that are actually pyramids, crop patterns revealing buried walls, mounds that are really collapsed temples. The earth remembers everything humanity has built upon it. Every city leaves scars and signatures that persist for thousands of years, written in a language most people never learn to read, but archaeologists do. And once you understand their methods, you begin to see the past everywhere. The fundamental skill of finding lost cities is deceptively simple. Observation, not excavation, not technology, not luck. Just careful, systematic looking. The ground beneath our feet holds records of everything that happened there, and those records are visible to anyone who knows the signs. Consider topography. Natural landscapes rarely form perfect geometric shapes. When you see an unnaturally flat mound in an otherwise rolling field, or a depression that forms a suspiciously straight line, or a hill with corners, you are likely looking at human construction buried beneath centuries of soil. Rivers do not create rectangles. Erosion does not carve perfect circles. Geometry in nature usually means people. Vegetation tells its own stories. Plants growing over buried stone foundations struggle to send roots deep, so they stay shorter and turn brown faster during droughts. Plants growing over collapsed mud brick buildings, which retain moisture better than surrounding soil, often flourish with unusual vigor. From above, these patterns create crop marks, ghostly outlines of ancient walls visible only from certain heights and in certain seasons. Farmers in Britain noticed for centuries that certain fields never grew wheat well. They cursed the poor soil without realizing they were farming over Roman villas. Soil color changes where humans have lived. Ancient trash heaps, called middens, create darker patches rich with organic material. Fire pits leave permanent discoloration. Buried structures create lighter streaks where stone or clay interrupts the natural earth. Plowed fields sometimes reveal these patterns after rain, when moisture evaporates at different rates from disturbed and undisturbed ground. And then there are the artifacts themselves. Pottery shards eroding from hillsides. Building stones tumbled into streams. Metal objects surfacing after storms. These fragments are the most direct evidence, breadcrumbs leading back to forgotten settlements. Archaeologists combine these clues through systematic survey. They walk landscapes in careful patterns, recording every artifact and anomaly. They dig small test pits, sampling what lies beneath the surface without committing to full excavation. They study historical maps and property records, comparing old descriptions to current terrain. They analyze aerial photographs taken decades ago, sometimes revealing features that have since been built over or erased. Many famous discoveries came through landscape reading. Machu Picchu was never truly lost. When Hiram Bingham arrived in 1911, local farmers guided him directly to the ruins. They had always known about the old city on the mountain. They simply lacked the historical context to understand its significance to outsiders. Angkor's vast extent became clear when archaeologists noticed linear features stretching through the jungle, geometric patterns too regular to be natural. Roman cities across Europe were identified by agricultural anomalies that had puzzled farmers for generations. This reveals an uncomfortable truth about archaeological discovery. Most lost cities were never lost to everyone. Indigenous peoples and local communities often preserved knowledge of ancient sites for centuries. The so-called discovery frequently meant Western archaeologists learning what others had always known. Early archaeology often ignored or dismissed this local knowledge. Modern practice has evolved, prioritizing collaboration with communities who are the true custodians of their own history. Reading landscapes works. It has revealed thousands of sites across every continent, but it is slow, labor-intensive, and limited by what the human eye can perceive from ground level. What if you could see through jungle canopy, beneath desert sand, under ocean waves? What if you could map entire lost cities without digging a single hole? That is exactly what modern technology now allows. And it is revealing lost cities faster than archaeologists can possibly excavate them. In 2018, scientists pointed lasers at the Guatemalan jungle. They expected to find a few dozen unknown Mayan sites, additions to the hundreds already documented through a century of ground-based archaeology. Instead, they found 60,000 structures. Houses, palaces, pyramids, fortifications, causeways connecting cities across vast distances. In a matter of weeks, laser technology revealed more about Mayan civilization than generations of machete-wielding explorers had uncovered in 100 years, and it forces us to ask what else is hiding under the trees. The technology responsible for this revolution is called LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. The concept is elegantly simple. Aircraft fly over terrain carrying specialized scanners. These scanners pulse laser beams toward the ground millions of times per second, measuring precisely how long each pulse takes to bounce back. Most lasers hit tree canopy and return quickly, but some slip through gaps in the leaves and reach the ground below. Advanced software filters out the vegetation returns, keeping only the signals that touched Earth. What remains is a detailed topographic map of the ground's surface, revealing every mound, depression, and geometric anomaly hidden beneath even the densest jungle. The results have been staggering. That Guatemalan survey in the Petian region did not just find scattered ruins. It revealed an interconnected urban landscape with defensive walls suggesting organized warfare, agricultural terraces indicating intensive farming, and road networks proving that isolated city-states were actually part of a much larger civilization. Previous population estimates for the ancient Maya have been revised upward by millions. What we thought we knew was barely a fraction of the truth. Similar revelations have emerged worldwide. LiDAR surveys in Cambodia have rewritten our understanding of Angkor, showing that the temple complex was merely the ceremonial center of a metropolitan area stretching across hundreds of square miles. In the Amazon, laser mapping has uncovered vast earthworks and geometric structures, proving that the rainforest supported far larger populations than anyone believed. Pre-Columbian cities are appearing in regions once considered pristine wilderness, challenging the myth of an empty jungle waiting for European discovery. LiDAR is not the only technology transforming archaeology. Ground-penetrating radar sends electromagnetic pulses into the earth, creating images of buried walls, tombs, and hidden chambers without moving a single stone. Magnetometry detects variations in iron content, revealing ancient hearths, pottery kilns, and buildings destroyed by fire. Satellite imaging captures wavelengths invisible to human eyes, showing buried structures that appear only in infrared or ultraviolet. Drones equipped with high-resolution cameras create three-dimensional models of sites from angles impossible to reach on foot. Even cosmic rays have become archaeological tools. Particles called muons rain constantly from space, passing through solid matter at predictable rates. By measuring how muons travel through ancient structures, scientists detected a previously unknown void inside the Great Pyramid of Giza, a hidden chamber that had remained secret for over 4,000 years. These technologies have fundamentally changed what archaeology can accomplish. Researchers now map sites without damaging them through excavation. They survey dangerous areas, including active minefields and politically unstable regions, from the safety of aircraft or satellite orbit. They identify the most promising locations for focused excavation, making fieldwork more efficient and less destructive. They document threatened sites before looters or developers erase them forever. But technology has limitations. These tools generate enormous datasets requiring specialized skills to interpret. Initial surveys remain expensive, putting them beyond the reach of many researchers in developing countries. Computers can detect anomalies, but only human expertise can determine their significance. A rectangular shadow on a LiDAR image might be an ancient palace or a natural rock formation. Technology reveals possibilities, archaeologists confirm realities. There is also a deeper challenge. Remote sensing can show us where cities existed. It can map their streets and measure their walls. But it cannot tell us what the people who built them believed, feared, hoped, or loved. It cannot explain why civilizations rose or fell. It cannot interpret the meaning of symbols carved into temple stones or painted on palace walls. Still, we are living through a golden age of discovery. Estimates now suggest thousands of significant sites remain unexcavated worldwide, hidden not because no one looked, but because jungle, desert, or ocean concealed them until technology could pierce those veils. Major announcements arrive regularly. The next transformative discovery could come tomorrow. Technology can reveal hidden cities, but it cannot interpret them. It cannot tell us what people thought, believed, or felt. That requires a different kind of detective work, reading clues left in artifacts, architecture, and art. And sometimes those clues reveal secrets that change everything we thought we knew. Every broken pot, every collapsed wall, every burned layer of earth is a clue. Archaeologists are detectives solving mysteries thousands of years cold, piecing together vanished lives from fragments left behind. The work requires patience, expertise, and imagination. Buildings and artifacts are frozen communications from the past, messages waiting to be translated. And sometimes when the translation finally comes, the answers are terrifying. Consider what architecture alone reveals. The size and quality of housing exposes social hierarchies, showing us who held power and who served. Temple orientations indicate religious beliefs. Alignments with solstices or sacred mountains, encoding cosmologies we can partially reconstruct. Construction techniques demonstrate technological knowledge, engineering solutions that sometimes surpass what we might expect from ancient peoples. Fortifications reveal defense priorities in the presence of threats. Cooling systems, water channels, and building orientations show how civilizations adapted to their climates. Artifacts speak differently, but just as clearly. Pottery from distant regions proves trade networks spanning continents. Cooking vessels and grinding stones illuminate daily meals. Toys suggest childhood play across millennia. Luxury goods concentrated in certain buildings reveal wealth distribution. What people chose to create, decorate, and preserve exposes cultural values that words might never have recorded. But finding objects is only the beginning. Interpretation requires rigorous methods developed over centuries of practice. Stratigraphy reads the layers of occupation like pages in a book, with deeper deposits representing older periods. A burned layer might indicate conquest, a sterile gap might suggest abandonment, a sudden change in pottery styles might mark the arrival of new peoples. Typology tracks how objects evolve over time, allowing researchers to date discoveries by comparing them to established sequences. Contextual analysis examines relationships. understanding that a knife found beside a hearth means something different than one placed in a grave. Modern science has added extraordinary tools. Isotopic analysis of bones reveals diet, telling us whether people ate marine fish or farmed grain, and even identifying the geographic regions where individuals spent their childhoods. Ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains maps migration patterns, family relationships, and diseases that swept through populations. Residue analysis detects traces of food and drink in vessels thousands of years old. Certain discoveries have transformed our understanding entirely. Pompeii's catastrophe layer preserved exact moments of daily life interrupted. Loaves of bread still in ovens, graffiti still on walls, bodies frozen in final gestures. The Rosetta Stone's 3 translations of the same text unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphics, opening a civilization previously mute. Linear B tablets revealed that Mycenaean Greeks could write centuries earlier than scholars believed possible. The frozen body of Tinsi the Iceman preserved clothing, tools, tattoos, and even his final meal, offering intimate details of Copper Age existence. The Nebra Sky disk demonstrated sophisticated astronomical knowledge in Bronze Age Europe, challenging assumptions about ancient intellectual capabilities. Yet interpretation has boundaries. Preservation is brutally selective. Organic materials like wood, textiles, and paper survive only in extreme conditions, places of perpetual ice, absolute dryness, or oxygen-free waterlogged environments. For every artifact that endures, countless others have rotted into nothing. We see stone temples but miss the wooden houses surrounding them. We find bronze weapons but lose the leather armor they pierced. Symbolic meanings present even greater challenges. We might recognize religious architecture without understanding the specific beliefs practiced within. We can describe rituals without knowing the prayers spoken. Past people's motivations remain ultimately unknowable. We reconstruct what they did. We can only infer why. This uncertainty is not weakness but honesty. Archaeology builds plausible interpretations from limited evidence, constantly revising as new discoveries emerge. Multiple competing theories often coexist, and that tension drives the field forward. The goal is not definitive answers but increasingly refined questions. Ethical dimensions complicate the work further. Whose interpretation should prevail when outside archaeologists and descendant communities disagree? How do we balance scientific inquiry with respect for the dead? What right do we have to disturb burials and sacred sites? These questions have no easy resolutions, and responsible archaeology wrestles with them constantly. But archaeology's ultimate revelation transcends methodology. These lost cities were not inhabited by alien beings. They held people with hopes, fears, loves, and ambitions indistinguishable from our own. They faced challenges we recognize today: climate change, resource scarcity, social inequality, political conflict. Their ruins carry a message across millennia. We were here, we mattered, learn from us. We have explored lost cities across continents, climates, and centuries. We have seen them hidden by jungle, buried by sand, sunk beneath waves, and frozen in ice. But a troubling pattern has emerged. These cities did not fail randomly. They failed for reasons, and those reasons keep repeating. Every collapsed civilization thought they were different. They believed their gods favored them, their technology protected them, their knowledge made them invulnerable. They all learned the same lesson: you cannot negotiate with ecology. The earth does not care about monuments or armies or prayers. It responds only to what is taken and what is returned. And when the balance tips too far, cities die. Look back at the lost cities we have explored together. The Maya collapsed during a megadrought lasting decades, their reservoirs emptying, their crops withering, their populations scattering into jungle that reclaimed their temples. The Norse abandoned Greenland when the Little Ice Age made their farming practices impossible, clinging to traditions that no longer worked until the last of them perished. Angkor's magnificent hydraulic system, engineered to control monsoons and droughts, eventually failed when climate variability exceeded what even their genius could manage. Cities across ancient Mesopotamia exhausted their soil through centuries of intensive farming, turning fertile plains into salt-crusted wastelands. Easter Island civilization crumbled after they cut down every tree, eliminating the resources needed to fish, farm, and survive. These were not primitive peoples who failed to understand their environment. They were sophisticated civilizations that succeeded so spectacularly they pushed their ecosystems past sustainable limits. Success itself created vulnerability. During favorable conditions, populations grew. Agricultural production intensified to feed more mouths. Infrastructure expanded to serve larger communities. And with each advancement, the margin for error shrank. When conditions changed, when the rains failed or the temperatures dropped, those larger populations faced catastrophic shortages that smaller communities might have survived. The mechanisms of environmental collapse follow predictable patterns. Forests cut faster than they regenerate eventually disappear entirely, as happened on Easter Island and across ancient Greece. Fish stocks harvested beyond replacement rates collapse suddenly rather than gradually. Soil farmed continuously without adequate rest loses fertility until nothing will grow. Aquifers pumped faster than rainfall can replenish them drop lower each year until wells run dry. These processes often remain invisible until they reach critical thresholds, then cascade rapidly into crisis. Pre-industrial cities were exquisitely sensitive to climate variation. They lacked the global trade networks that now move food from surplus regions to deficit ones. A few consecutive bad harvests could spiral into famine, social unrest, and political collapse. The margin of survival was far thinner than our modern abundance allows us to remember. Climate changes did not need to be dramatic to prove catastrophic. Even modest shifts in rainfall patterns or growing seasons could doom civilizations that had calibrated their existence to conditions that no longer held. Researchers have studied these patterns extensively. Some emphasize environmental factors as primary drivers of collapse. Others argue that societies fail when maintaining their complexity becomes too costly, when the effort required to sustain infrastructure and institutions exceeds the benefits they provide. Current scholarship tends to integrate multiple factors, recognizing that environment, social structure, politics, and culture interact in ways that resist simple explanations. But environmental limits appear consistently as either direct causes or amplifying pressures that turn manageable problems into existential crises. The uncomfortable question hangs in the air. Our civilization depends on stable climate, abundant cheap energy, and functioning global supply chains. We are pushing environmental limits through carbon emissions, biodiversity loss, and ocean acidification. Our population is historically unprecedented. Our agricultural system relies on fossil fuels, genetically uniform crops, and aquifers that are depleting measurably each year. Are we different from the Maya, the Norse, the Easter Islanders? Or are we simply operating at larger scale with further to fall? Modern technology gives us capabilities ancient peoples lacked. Global trade creates resilience through diversification. We have warning systems, scientific understanding, and the theoretical ability to adapt consciously rather than reactively. But we also face challenges unprecedented in scope. Our problems are global, not local. The speed of change outpaces our adaptation. Our complexity creates brittleness. And political divisions hamper the coordinated responses that survival might require. Perhaps we will prove exceptional. Perhaps our tools will save us where ancient knowledge failed. But every collapsed civilization believed the same thing. Environment does not explain everything, however. Some cities collapsed with resources still available, with climate stable, with no visible ecological crisis. These failures were social rather than ecological. Cities that tore themselves apart from within. Some cities died with full granaries and clear skies. Their fields still produced harvests. Their rivers still flowed. Their forests still stood. They did not run out of resources. They ran out of reasons to stay together. And this forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The bonds holding cities together are more fragile than the stones they are built from. What happens when trust breaks down? What holds a civilization together when its people stop believing in each other? Rome did not fall because it exhausted its farmland or depleted its forests. The empire collapsed through internal divisions, political instability, and institutional decay that accumulated over centuries. Succession crises destabilized leadership. Civil wars drained treasuries and armies. Corruption eroded administrative effectiveness. By the time external pressures mounted, the social fabric had already torn beyond repair. The barbarians who eventually sacked Rome walked through gates that Romans themselves had left undefended. The Maya present a similar pattern viewed differently. Many of their cities show evidence of intensifying warfare between neighboring states in the years before abandonment. Rather than uniting against environmental challenges, they fragmented into competing factions that weakened each other through constant conflict. Political rivalry prevented the coordinated response that survival might have required. Cities in the ancient Indus Valley show yet another variation. Archaeological evidence of declining craft quality and urban organization, suggesting that social systems deteriorated even as physical infrastructure remained intact. The mechanisms of social collapse follow recognizable patterns. Inequality appears consistently in the archaeological record before abandonment. Elite residences grow larger and more lavish while common housing deteriorates. Luxury goods concentrate in fewer hands. The gap between those who have and those who labor widens until it becomes a chasm. When inequality reaches extreme levels, social cohesion dissolves. Lower classes lose their stake in maintaining systems that benefit only their rulers. Elites lose legitimacy when they fail to provide the public goods that justify their privilege, security, justice, functioning infrastructure, and hope for the future. Political instability accelerates the unraveling. Succession crises, coups, and civil conflicts destabilize governance. Trade networks that depend on political authority collapse when that authority weakens. Infrastructure maintenance declines as coordination fails. Public safety deteriorates as institutions crumble. Each failure feeds the next in cascading sequences that can transform prosperous cities into abandoned ruins within generations. Perhaps most devastating is the loss of legitimacy. Many ancient cities operated as theocracies where rulers claimed divine favor. When prayers failed to bring rain, when sacrifices failed to prevent military defeat, when the gods seemed to abandon their chosen people, rulers lost the authority that made governance possible. The modern equivalent unfolds when institutions fail to deliver their promises of prosperity, security, and justice. People stop believing in systems that no longer serve them, and cities cannot survive populations that have stopped believing. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE demonstrates how interconnected systems can fail together. Major civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed nearly simultaneously, their trade networks and mutual dependencies meaning that problems in one region cascaded rapidly across all others. The whole proved more fragile than any individual part. Cities are cooperation machines. They concentrate populations far too large to survive without constant coordination. This requires institutions to organize collective action, social norms to regulate behavior, and shared beliefs to justify sacrifice for common good. When these intangible structures break down, the physical city cannot function regardless of available resources. Collapse can arrive with terrifying speed once social cooperation fails. Buildings stand for centuries after the societies that built them have scattered to the winds. The parallels to our present moment require no elaboration. Declining institutional trust, political polarization, growing inequality, fragmented information environments that prevent shared understanding of reality. These patterns are visible to anyone willing to look. We have seen environmental limits and social fractures. But there remains a third factor, perhaps the most important of all. Can societies adapt when challenged? Some collapsed civilizations could have survived. They possessed the knowledge, resources, and time. They failed because they could not change. The Norse Greenlanders died surrounded by food they refused to eat. The waters teemed with fish. Seals basked on nearby shores. The Inuit who lived beside them thrived on these resources for generations. But the Norse starved. They possessed the technology to hunt seals. they chose not to. Why? Because eating fish would mean they were no longer Viking farmers. They would rather die as themselves than live as something different. How many civilizations have made the same choice? This is perhaps the most haunting pattern in the archaeology of collapse. Societies that possessed the knowledge, resources, and time to survive but could not bring themselves to change. The Maya had sophisticated engineering and mathematical capabilities unmatched in the ancient Americas. Yet they never developed the technologies needed to cope with prolonged drought. Pacific Island societies cut down their last trees despite surely understanding the consequences, continuing practices that guaranteed their destruction. Intelligent people made collectively suicidal decisions, and they did so for reasons we can understand all too well. Cultural identity creates invisible prisons. Societies invest not just economically but psychologically in particular ways of life. The Norse defined themselves as European Christians and farmers, not Arctic hunters. Their churches, their cattle, their grain fields were not merely survival strategies but expressions of who they believed themselves to be. Admitting that this identity was maladapted to Greenland's cooling climate would have required existential transformation. People often choose familiar death over the terror of becoming unrecognizable to themselves. Sunk costs compound the paralysis. Civilizations spend centuries building infrastructure, institutions, and cultural systems calibrated to specific environments. Abandoning these investments represents catastrophic loss. Short-term thinking favors squeezing final returns from failing systems, rather than enduring the pain of transition to new approaches. The Maya kept building temples even as their populations declined. Rome kept minting coins even as its economy disintegrated. Doubling down on the familiar feels safer than leaping into the unknown, even when the familiar is killing you. Elites often resist necessary changes most fiercely. Ruling classes benefit from existing arrangements. Transformations that might save overall society frequently threaten established privileges. Those who control resources needed for adaptation have the strongest incentives to prevent it. Necessary changes get blocked, delayed, and diluted until the window for adaptation closes and collapse becomes inevitable. Complexity itself becomes a trap. Societies grow more intricate over time, developing interdependencies that constrain future choices. Systems evolve along particular paths that eliminate alternative options. At some point, adaptation might require simplification, abandoning sophisticated arrangements for more resilient but less impressive alternatives. This feels like failure, like regression, like admitting that your ancestors' achievements were mistakes. Few societies can stomach such admissions until catastrophe leaves no choice. Yet some societies have adapted successfully. The Dutch transformed their relationship with water rather than fighting losing battles against the sea. Tokugawa Japan restructured its entire economy and social system to survive isolation. Research on these survivors reveals common traits: flexible institutions capable of experimentation, willingness to learn from neighbors or subordinate groups, distributed power, allowing diverse approaches rather than centralized rigidity, and cultural narratives that valued adaptability over tradition. The painful lesson emerges clearly. Survival often requires transforming identity itself, willingness to become something different from what you were. The Norse who might have survived Greenland were those willing to stop being Norse. Cities that endured crises adapted their economies, their governance, and sometimes even their gods. Rigidity is fatal. Adaptation demands the courage to abandon patterns that once brought success but no longer serve. We have explored dozens of lost cities across continents and millennia. We have traced the patterns of their collapse, environmental limits exceeded, social bonds fractured, adaptation refused. But these are not merely history lessons preserved in stone and soil. They are warnings written by the dead for the living. And the final question now demands an answer. Are we building tomorrow's lost cities right now? Miami Beach, Jakarta, Venice, world-class cities slowly drowning. Their streets flood on sunny days, their foundations sink into softening earth, their futures grow shorter with each passing year. Will our grandchildren visit them the way we visit Pompeii, shaking their heads at people who saw disaster coming but could not change course? The lost cities of tomorrow are not hypothetical. they are losing ground right now. Consider Miami Beach, the glittering strip of luxury condominiums and Art Deco hotels. Sea level rise has already transformed daily life there. Streets flood during high tides even without storms. Salt water infiltrates freshwater systems. Insurance costs spiral upward. Engineers install pumps and raise roads, but these are temporary measures against an ocean that rises a little more each year. Some projections suggest much of coastal Florida may become uninhabitable by the end of this century. Not destroyed by sudden catastrophe, but slowly surrendered to water that refuses to retreat. Jakarta tells an even more urgent story. Indonesia's capital is sinking at rates reaching 25 centimeters per year in some areas among the fastest subsidence on Earth. Groundwater extraction has caused the city to collapse into the void left behind. Meanwhile, the Java Sea rises to meet it. The Indonesian government has begun building an entirely new capital on the island of Borneo, a $1 trillion acknowledgement that Jakarta cannot be saved. A city of 10 million people is being written off within our lifetimes. Venice has fought water for centuries, but the battle grows more desperate. Flooding events that once occurred a few times per decade now happen dozens of times yearly. The city has constructed massive tide barriers at enormous expense, but even these may only delay the inevitable as seas continue rising. Pacific island nations face complete erasure. Tuvalu and Kiribati, entire countries may vanish beneath waves within this century. Their citizens are already climate refugees, seeking new homelands before the old ones disappear entirely. Australian cities battle intensifying fires and heat waves that render outdoor work dangerous for growing portions of the year. Middle Eastern cities approach wet, bulb temperatures where human bodies cannot cool themselves through sweating, making survival impossible without air conditioning. Phoenix and Las Vegas drain aquifers faster than nature replenishes them, racing toward water crises that arithmetic makes inevitable. These are not distant projections, they are present realities measured in flooded streets and relocation plans. The causes are understood: thermal expansion of warming oceans, melting ice sheets adding water that was locked away for millennia, groundwater extraction, causing cities to sink into themselves, heat accumulating in urban environments designed for climates that no longer exist. Responses vary dramatically. Wealthy nations engineer elaborate defenses, seawalls, pumping systems, elevated infrastructure. Poor nations lack resources for such solutions and face the cruelest climate injustice, suffering most from changes they contributed least to causing. Within countries, the same inequality operates. Affluent neighborhoods receive protection while poor communities flood. The question of which cities deserve saving reveals uncomfortable truths about whose lives we value. Modern people assume cities are permanent. We have forgotten that urban existence depends on favorable conditions that history shows can change. A century of relative stability has bred dangerous overconfidence. Developers build luxury towers in flood zones. Municipalities approve construction in fire corridors. Homeowners invest life savings in properties that may be worthless within decades. We see the patterns of the past and somehow believe ourselves exempt. Some cities have already crossed thresholds. New Orleans neighborhoods abandoned after Hurricane Katrina remain empty nearly 2 decades later. Syrian cities depopulated by climate-driven drought and subsequent civil war stand as ruins in an ongoing conflict. Australian towns have been forsaken after repeated fires made rebuilding pointless. The numbers stagger comprehension. Some estimates suggest hundreds of millions of people may need to relocate due to climate change by century's end. Refugee flows of that magnitude will reshape political and social maps worldwide, creating pressures that existing institutions may not survive. The threats are real and immediate. But history also teaches that collapse is not inevitable. Some cities survive crises that destroy others. The question is not whether we face challenges, but whether we can respond. What would it take to ensure our cities do not become tomorrow's ruins? Every collapsed civilization thought they were special. The Maya believed their gods would provide. The Romans trusted their legions would protect them forever. The Norse assumed their way of life would endure unchanged. They all believed the rules did not apply to them. We have one advantage they never possessed: we can see our mistakes before they kill us. The question that will define our century is whether we use that advantage or squander it. Consider what we possess that no previous civilization could imagine. Global communication networks allow instant coordination across continents. Scientific understanding illuminates climate systems, ecological relationships, and social dynamics with unprecedented clarity. Technological capabilities offer adaptation options our ancestors could not have conceived. Historical and archaeological knowledge reveals exactly what went wrong before, the patterns that led thriving cities to become silent ruins. Most crucially, we see the problems approaching. We have time to respond. No collapsed civilization had all these advantages, most had none of them. But we also faced challenges unprecedented in human history. The scale of our impact is global rather than local. When the Maya depleted their region, other civilizations continued elsewhere. Our environmental disruption affects the entire planet simultaneously, leaving nowhere to retreat. The speed of change outpaces previous transitions, compressing into decades what once unfolded across centuries. Our population exceeds any level that previous agricultural systems sustained. The complexity of our interconnected systems creates fragility, where failures cascade across networks in ways simpler societies never experienced, and political divisions hamper the coordinated responses that global problems demand. Archaeological research offers lessons we ignore at our peril. The environmental lesson is unambiguous. Sustainability is not optional. Societies that exceed their ecological limits collapse regardless of how sophisticated their technology appears. Modern innovation has not exempted us from ecological constraints. It has merely postponed the reckoning while increasing the eventual cost. Transition to renewable resources and circular economies is not idealism but pragmatic necessity. The social lesson echoes across every collapsed city we have explored. Inequality destabilizes civilizations. When small elites capture most wealth while majorities struggle, social cooperation breaks down. The archaeological record shows this pattern repeatedly. Luxury goods concentrating in fewer hands while common housing deteriorates, just before abandonment. Modern extreme inequality mirrors these warning signs precisely. Creating broadly shared prosperity is not merely ethical aspiration, but survival strategy. The adaptation lesson may matter most. Rigidity kills. Civilizations that cannot transform when circumstances change will fail, regardless of their past achievements. We must value adaptability over tradition when survival requires transformation. This means willingness to restructure economic systems, transition energy sources, reimagine food production, and even modify cultural practices that no longer serve us. Positive signs exist for those willing to see them. Renewable energy grows cheaper than fossil fuels in most markets. Environmental consciousness spreads through younger generations. Indigenous knowledge receives recognition after centuries of dismissal. International cooperation succeeds on some issues despite nationalist pressures. Technological innovations in carbon capture, vertical farming, and clean energy offer genuine possibilities, but obstacles remain formidable. Fossil fuel interests resist transition with vast resources. Short-term political thinking sacrifices future survival for present convenience. Nationalism undermines cooperation that global problems require. Disinformation prevents the shared understanding of reality that collective action demands. Inequality grows rather than shrinks in most countries. Here is the critical insight archaeology offers. Societies that survived crises were not necessarily the most technologically advanced or wealthiest. They were the most adaptable and cohesive. They could change was needed. They maintained cooperation when cooperation mattered. Some modern cities embody these qualities. Copenhagen commits to carbon neutrality. Singapore innovates water management for a water-scarce future. Communities worldwide build resilience through local cooperation and indigenous wisdom. We have something most collapsed civilizations lacked: genuine choice. We can see threats clearly. We possess tools to respond. We know what destroyed others before us. Whether we become a lost civilization is not predetermined by forces beyond our control. It depends on decisions we make now, in this generation, in these years. The lost cities we have explored together, from jungle-covered pyramids to underwater temples, from ice-preserved settlements to modern ghost towns, all have one final lesson to teach. And it is the most important lesson of all. 1,000 years from now, will archaeologists excavate our cities? Will they brush dust from our towers and catalogue our artifacts? Will they shake their heads and wonder why we did not change when we still had the chance? The ruins of lost civilizations are speaking to us across millennia. The only question that matters now is whether we are listening. We have journeyed together across continents and centuries. We have walked through jungle-covered pyramids where priests once called down rain from gods who stopped answering. We have descended into cities buried beneath desert sands, their populations scattered by droughts they could not outlast. We have dived to temples submerged beneath rising seas, their stones colonized by coral, their prayers silenced by waves. We have stood in frozen settlements where entire cultures vanished into ice and legend. We have wandered through modern ghost towns where the future died in a single afternoon of invisible poison. Dozens of civilizations, thousands of years, one pattern repeating endlessly. What makes a city lost? We understand now that it is not the crumbling of walls. Buildings stand for thousands of years after the people who built them vanish. Stones endure. It is the stories that die. Cities are lost when people stop believing in them, when social cooperation dissolves, when the reasons for staying together disappear into conflict, scarcity, or despair. A city is not architecture. A city is a shared story told by thousands of voices agreeing to build something together. When that story ends, only ruins remain. Every vanished civilization believed they were eternal. Every collapsed society thought they were special, that the old rules did not apply to their innovations and achievements. Every abandoned city once seemed permanent to the people raising children in its streets. The Maya carved their confidence into stone temples that jungle consumed. The Romans stamped their certainty onto coins that outlasted their empire by centuries. The citizens of Pripyat planned May Day celebrations in an amusement park that never opened. None of them saw their end approaching, or perhaps some did see it, but could not bring themselves to believe it would actually arrive. This is the profound truth these ruins offer. Cities are human creations. They are not natural features of the landscape that exist independently of our choices. They persist only as long as we maintain them, only as long as we cooperate to keep their systems functioning, only as long as we adapt when circumstances demand transformation. This means cities are fragile in ways we prefer not to acknowledge, but it also means we possess agency. Collapse is not inevitable fate written in stars or genes. It is the result of choices, systems, and responses. It can be prevented by different choices, better systems, wiser responses. The ruins reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature. We are capable of extraordinary achievements. We build temples that inspire awe across millennia. We create cities of stunning beauty and complexity. We develop knowledge that unlocks mysteries of the cosmos. But we are equally capable of collective self-destruction. We devastate environments that sustain us. We fracture societies that protect us. We refuse adaptations that could save us. Which capacity dominates in any given civilization depends entirely on choices, both individual and collective. The greatest gift these lost cities offer is not their treasures or their beauty. It is their warning. They show us that civilization is temporary unless constantly renewed. They demonstrate that success becomes failure when it stops being sustainable. They prove that sophistication provides no immunity against collapse. They reveal that the time to respond to crisis is before catastrophe arrives. Imagine a future archaeologist studying our remains. What will our ruins tell them? Will they see a civilization that recognized its challenges and transformed itself to meet them? Or will they see another vanished people who knew what was coming but could not change course? The ruins speak across centuries with a single message: we were here, we thought we would last forever, we were wrong, do not make our mistakes. Whether our cities become tomorrow's ruins depends on whether we hear this message and act upon it. The choice belongs to us. The time is now. The lost cities have spoken. The rest is up to the living.